What does it mean for a world to be born? If birth is usually a slow, private thing, a quiet slipping from darkness into light, then the birth of the planet is its opposite, a violent, public, unrelenting orchestration of chaos and gravity. The question hangs like a single bright thought at the edge of memory. How does inert dust become a living stage? In the deep silence that existed around a newborn star, the answer began as motion. Around a young sun, a flattened disk of rock and ice spun like the residue of some cosmic mill. Tiny motes of dust, silicates, metals, and frozen compounds circled in that protoplanetary disk, each grain tracing a slow, immutable path. There was no intention in their movement, no plan, only physics, collisions, sticking, the subtle electrostatic embrace of particles, and the inexorable tug of gravity. Over thousands, perhaps millions of years, the smallest combinations made slightly larger ones. Pebbles formed, pebbles gathered into boulders. Boulders grew, then coaxed more collisions by their increasing pull until they crossed a threshold. They became planetesimals, blobs of matter whose gravity could bend the trajectories of their neighbours. The story of Earth begins in that gradual congregation. It was not a single moment so much as an accretional insistence. Each encounter was a gamble, a miniature catastrophe in slow motion. When two planetesimals met, their encounter was not a gentle embrace, but an energetic surrender. Velocities high, heat generated, surfaces melted and fused. In these collisions, energy was translated into temperature. Where edges struck, rock turned to vapor. Those flashes of heat, repeated an innumerable number of times, were the furnace in which Earth's identity was forged. This was a birth by impact. The adolescent proto-Earth was a violent thing, a growing, half-formed sphere, swollen with heat. Its interior was a roiling cauldron, warmed not only by the rubble that kept joining its mass, but by the decay of radioactive elements embedded within. The more mass it collected, the deeper its potential. Well, the more energetic each new collision became. Gravity, once merely a gentle curvature of space around dust, had become the decisive architect. In the first tens of millions of years, the surface of that emergent planet was not a place to stand. It was a sea of molten rock, a magma ocean stretching nearly endlessly, reflecting as much light as darkness. The term surface is almost misleading here. There was no solid ground, only a skin of vapor and incandescent lava. The air, if it could be called that, was choked with vapors of silicate and metal, thick clouds of steam, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, methane, and sulfurous gases. It was an atmosphere toxic in the sense that it would have killed any future observer instantly. But it was a crucible for future chemistry, an envelope of volatility and raw potential where elements traded electrons with little regard for stability. Collisions were not merely frequent, some were epoch-defining. Among these cataclysms, there was one of particular consequence. A titanic meeting between the proto-Earth and a body roughly the size of Mars, later whispered across scientific models as Theia. This was no routine accretional knot. It was a cataclysm with the force to reshape a planetary system. When the impact occurred, it did not so much strike as rewrite the young planet's story. The impactor sheared off a vast portion of mantle material. Plumes of incandescent rock and vapor were flung into orbit, forming a smoky, molten ring around the embers of the planet. Over time and by the persistent pull of gravity, this debris coalesced into the Moon, a companion birthed in trauma. That collision altered more than geometry. It injected enormous angular momentum, likely imparting the Earth with its axial tilt, the reason for seasons, and gave the planet a rotational pace that would evolve into the day-night rhythm billions of years later. It redistributed heat, melted vast tracts of the planet anew, and set the stage for differentiation, the process by which heavy elements sank to form a dense core, while lighter silicates rose to fashion a mantle and, eventually, a crust. The interior rearranged itself like a pot of soup forced to settle, an iron heart forming at the center, encased by a silicate shell. This became the seed of Earth's magnetic field, as convective motions within that iron core later led to the dynamo effect that would, eons hence, shield surface chemistry from cosmic radiation and solar fury. The view from a human perspective would be instantaneous horror. A sky torn by incandescent fragments, an atmosphere blistering, the very notion of habitability absurd. Yet within that horror, an essential sequence of legacies was being written. The surface cooling, not instant nor linear, but a patient falling of temperatures, gave rise to a first tenuous crust. Islands of solid rock floated upon the magma until, under their own evolving behavior and the planet's cooling whims, they thickened and merged. Between these freezing episodes, the sky rained molten droplets. Each drop that fell froze into rocky fragments that further accumulated to form early continents. The earliest lithosphere was fickle and fragmented, tectonics in infancy, plates forming, colliding, subducting, then reforming like the surface of a living creature learning to grow skin. The early atmosphere mirrored this tumult. At first, it had been a superheated fog of vaporized rock and metal. As temperatures subsided enough for volatiles to condense, oceans began to form, but not immediately. Water was both present in the volatile inventory of the planet and delivered by cometry and asteroidal impacts. Whether the majority of Earth's water was indigenous or imported remains a subject of debate, but in any case, the early surface would eventually bear liquid water. These oceans condensed from steam and cosmic donations alike, and their very existence cooled the planet further by drawing heat into latent energy of vaporization. Yet these first seas were not placid. They were boiling, acidified, and laced with dissolved metals and organics liberated by the stupendous heat and chemical violence. The chemistry that unfolded in those iron-tinted waters deserves particular attention. Under pressure and heat, with a composition biased towards carbon dioxide, nitrogen, ammonia, and hydrogen sulfide, a complex palette of reactions unfolded. Lightning, common in storm-dense fiery atmospheres, and ultraviolet radiation from an energetic young sun drove electronic rearrangements. Simple molecules broke, recombined, and occasionally formed larger, more complex chains. Organic molecules, sometimes as simple as formaldehyde or hydrogen cyanide, may have formed and accumulated in surface films or at mineral interfaces. Clays and catalytic mineral surfaces could have concentrated these molecules, providing a scaffold for further syntheses. In other words, the early Earth, violent as it was, offered niches where chemical complexity could increase, pools and vents where energy flowed across gradients and where the raw components of future life could come together. All of this transpired over scales that are hard to appreciate. Human life treats a century as a long time, and yet the early scenes of planet formation unfurled across millions of years. A single asteroid strike, representing but a moment in geological time, could vaporize continents and empty the sky, while the planet itself was the product of uncountable such moments, each compounding the last. To think in human terms is almost vanity. To think in deep time is to accept a humbling perspective. The Earth's infancy was lengthy, enormously patient and absurdly wasteful, in the sense that it discarded and repurposed matter with carefree abandon. There is a particular kind of melancholy in that wastefulness. The bodies that struck the proto-Earth carried within them material that would never be. The mineralogical fingerprints of other nascent worlds, icy inventories from the outskirts, carbon-rich clumps that might otherwise have evolved along a different trajectory. They were consumed and assimilated, becoming part of a larger enterprise. In this sense, Earth's identity is a palimpsest, its makeup inscribed and then overwritten by successive impacts. The narrative that emerges is one of constant reinvention, heat and pressure, sculpting long-term stability out of tempestuous beginnings. Through all the fury, a slow, almost imperceptible softening began. The planet that had been a furnace cooled enough for steam to condense into rain. The first rains may have hissed on a world still below the boiling point, and their sound, if one could have stood and listened, would have been like the sigh of a body finally allowed to relieve itself. Rock cracked, chemical equilibria shifted, and the first thin crust began to behave less like a molten sea and more like a planet. In fissures and at hydrothermal vents, redox gradients became available. The energy flows that would, billions of years later, feed biology were present in a primitive form. Gradients of temperature, electrical potentials across mineral boundaries, and a surplus of reduced chemical species eager to oxidize. It is tempting to narrate this process as teleological, as if the Earth wanted to become hospitable. That would be a human projection. In truth, Earth was indifferent to destiny. It was an arena where improbable stability slowly emerged from combinatorial madness. The conditions that allowed life to arise were not inevitable, but once established, they created pathways that could be walked. Among countless possible outcomes, one of them produced persistent, self-replicating chemistry. Whether that course was orchestrated by specific initial conditions or was merely one permissible phase among many is a question that bridges science and wonder. There is also the matter of scale and intimacy, the molecules that would later constitute living cells. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus were present, abundant, and ever interacting. The atom's rearrangements, imperceptible in human terms, were the only real drama taking place at the smallest levels. In the incandescent chaos of early Earth, a chance ordering of atoms might have created a polymer with the peculiar property of templating itself. That templating offers the first glimmer of persistence, a chemical pattern that could survive long enough to be copied. Once copying exists, selection begins, and with selection, the world enters a new mode of history, one written not only by celestial mechanics, but by heredity. Still, in this earliest chapter, there was no life yet as minds understand it. There were only processes: accretion, melting, outgassing, cooling, condensation, differentiation, the cycling of matter between surface and interior. There was the moon, forged in fire, which would later moderate tides and possibly affect climate and evolutionary pathways. There were oceans heavy with dissolved metals and acids. There were the first fragile plates forming like crusty skin upon a still angry beast. And there were impacts, small and large, that kept rewriting the conditions, testing nascent equilibria. For anyone thinking in human temporalities, there is an uneasy beauty to this. The scene offers simultaneity, magnificent violence, coupled with the emergence of delicate chemistry, chaos harmonizing into a stable rhythm over hundreds of millions of years. It forces a kind of philosophical vertigo that from a disk of dust, under the governance of simple forces, complex opportunities can arise. It invites humility. Our modern lives with cities and digital networks will later seem like ephemeral frosting atop a cake baked for eons in a cosmic oven. The early epoch of Earth's formation is not simply prologue to life, it is the necessary context, the forensic record of why and how certain trajectories were possible. Those violent early deeds, impacts, molten oceans, atmospheric convulsions, left residues, the composition of the crust, the volatile inventory of the atmosphere, the tilt of the axis, the presence of a large moon. Each residue would shape the contours of future habitability. Without such violence, the Earth might have been smaller, cooler, barren. Without it, the chemistry would have been different in ways that cannot be fully reconstructed. When the time finally came for the planet to settle into a more predictable rhythm, when volcanoes still belched and the young sun still had tantrums, but the surface could hold liquid and the crust could endure, the stage was set. The elements had moved from aimless dust to a planetary stage capable of hosting stable chemical plays. That transition, so slow it mocks human impatience, so consequential it underlies every subsequent chapter, was the hinge upon which Earth's long narrative would swing. And so, in the memory of deep time, the planet's birth is less a single event than an expansive metamorphosis. It is a sustained act of creation by collision and recomposition, a symphony of physical laws played at cosmic volume. The scene closes not with a flourish, but with a settling, the magma quieting into rock, the vapor condensing into rain, the air losing some of its primordial brutality. The earth, newly coherent, turned and began to cool, preparing for whatever would come next. From that first crucible of molten rock and toxic clouds, the possibilities for future complexity, perhaps even for ancient forgotten intelligences long erased by later epochs, were born. The question that opened the narration returns, now shaded by the knowledge of process and consequence. What does it mean for a world to be born? For Earth, it meant fury and patience, erasure and construction, randomness tempered into reliability. It meant that from dust and collision emerged not only rock and atmosphere, but a long, patient opportunity for new kinds of order to evolve. In that fragile opportunity lay the seeds that would, in distant chapters, weave the tapestry of oceans, continents, life, and, eventually, those very humans who would one day look back and ask how it all began. What does the first ocean sound like? The question itself is a kind of thought experiment, an attempt to translate something so vast and so ancient into a single sensory impression. The image that follows is not a scene to be watched so much as a needle in a record player that, when placed carefully on the grooves of time, plays back the faint, wet music of a planet that has finally cooled enough to weep. After the furious days of accretion and the catastrophic intimacy with Thea, the newborn Earth kept cooling in stages that were neither steady nor smooth. Vapor hung in a thick, nearly opaque shroud. Atmospheres were not quiet envelopes, but convulsing, chemically noisy theatres. As the heat bled away, sometimes quickly, sometimes stubbornly slow, the steam that had filled that dense air began to condense. At first it was a hesitant thing, flecks of water vapor clinging to cooler rock, hissing and vaporizing almost as soon as they touched. But as temperatures declined further, condensation became precipitation, and precipitation became rain that penetrated, for the first time on this scale, the surface. Those first drops were not the languid, gentle fall of modern drizzle. They arrived in a world still recoiling from fire. Rain that hissed and steamed, that cracked freshly forming crust and carved temporary gullies through powdery basalt, vaporizing on contact when it met a patch still near boiling. There was a moment, a long geologic moment, when the sound of rain would have been mostly the violent exhalations of vapor, the percussive patter of droplets exploding on red-hot rock. Yet within that tumult, a threshold crossed. Persistent pools and lakes could survive between thermal pulses. Cold pockets began to exist. The planet could, occasionally, retain liquid on its surface long enough for chemistry to conspire. The sources of this water were twofold. Some of it was native, trapped in minerals and released by volcanic outgassing. Much more arrived as gifts from beyond. Comets and water-rich asteroids, icy bodies that delivered their cold cargo when a collision allowed it to mingle with hot rock. The cosmic deliveries were stochastic, episodic, and sometimes brutal. Bombardments that could refill oceans and then, by their energy, boil them away. The period known as the Late Heavy Bombardment may have punctuated the era with repeated sterilizations. Yet even amid this battering, there were windows, sometimes long, sometimes brief, when liquid water persisted. Those windows, even the short ones, were the moments when the first experiments in chemistry could proceed without being instantly erased. If a human ear had been there, the soundscape would have been dominated by extremes. The sky would rumble with thunder produced by frequent, violent storms. Lightning would fork against a sun that was not quite the settled star of later epochs, slicing through an atmosphere rife with reactive gases. Volcanoes would hiss and clatter along the margins of newly forming continents, expelling sulphurous plumes into air that added a caustic tang to the rain. Yet beneath these enormous noises lay quieter, more intimate motions, droplets pooling, small rivulets braiding themselves over dark rock, the slow, patient drip of water into cavities where chemistry could linger and accumulate. The chemistry of the primordial seas was not the placid, life-friendly broth of some later world. They were acidic and iron-rich, often darkened by dissolved metals and steeped in the chemical traces of relentless volcanism. Carbon dioxide filled the atmosphere in abundance. Dissolved in water, it created acid that encouraged the leaching of elements from basalt. These seas were stocked with a rich inventory of molecules that modern biology would later lay claim to. Simple hydrocarbons, nitrogen-bearing compounds, ammonia, sulfides, and an array of small organic precursors formed both in situ and delivered from space. It is in the margins, the seam between land and sea, the dark mouths of hydrothermal vents, the intertidal pools tugged by a moon newly born and still close, where chemistry found the most promising locales to organize. The moon, forged in fire and rubble, carried with it a secondary legacy beyond companionship, an intense gravitational pull that produced tides stronger than those experienced today. The pull of such a young satellite would have repeatedly filled and flushed shallow pools, concentrating dissolved organics and alternately exposing them to wet-dry cycles that are ideal for certain kinds of polymer formation. The tidal choreography, the rhythm of fill and evaporation, became a natural concentrator, a primitive centrifuge where simple molecules could be assembled, tested, and sometimes preserved. There were other niches. At the bottom of the young oceans, along tectonically active rifts and fissures, black smokers, hydrothermal vents, belched mineral-rich, superheated fluids into frigid seawater. These vents drew chemical energy from the planet's interior. Reduced compounds like hydrogen sulfide met oxidized seawater and created steep redox gradients. Those gradients were, in thermodynamic terms, tiny engines, places where chemistry could do work and where energy could be harnessed to assemble and maintain structures. Modern extremophiles, and perhaps their earliest ancestors, exploit exactly these sources of energy. The vents were not calm places. They were volcanic mouths with fortunes to trade, offering heat and chemically rich plumes in exchange for stability in an otherwise volatile planet. On the surfaces of minerals such as clays and iron pyrite, molecules could concentrate and react in ways that free-floating solutions rarely permitted. Minerals acted as platforms, as primitive catalysts and scaffolds. They could bind molecules close together, orienting them so that reactions happened more readily. In shallow pools, evaporation concentrated organics far beyond what typical ocean dilution would allow. Wet-dry cycles could, in this way, drive polymerization, splicing together short chains into longer ones, the kind of chemistry that begins to look like the scaffolding of biology. Chains that can fold, form stable patterns, and occasionally catalyze their own formation. There are several competing narratives for how the first self-replicating systems took shape. One vision emphasizes information-carrying molecules, an RNA world in which nucleic acid chains both encoded information and catalyzed reactions. Another imagines metabolism. First scenarios where networks of chemical reactions anchored to mineral surfaces and powered by redox gradients became the precursors of life's energy-handling systems. The documentary of Deep Time cannot insist on one definitive script. It can, however, follow the logic that both pathways share: concentration, catalysis, and a reliable source of energy. In every plausible pathway, the conditions present on early Earth, the gradients of heat and chemistry, the availability of diverse molecules, and the dynamic environments created by tides and vents, provided arenas for protobiological experiments. Among those experiments, a crucial transition was the emergence of compartmentalization. Lipid-like molecules, available either from terrestrial synthesis or cosmic delivery, have a propensity to self-organize into spheres when they meet water. Tiny bubbles that can sequester internal chemistry from the external environment. Those vesicles created microcosms where reactions could be concentrated and where replicators, should they arise, would be protected from the chaotic wash of the surrounding sea. Within a vesicle, a molecule that could copy itself would find a selective advantage. It could influence the makeup of its own microenvironment, favoring conditions that favored its replication. Once copying exists, even in the most primitive form, selection begins, not in terms of intentional choice, but as differential persistence. The molecules that could be copied most reliably became more common. Over time, and over vast patience, those molecules could combine, compete, and innovate. The first true hints that biology had crossed the threshold from chemistry to heredity are faint and fragmentary, preserved in whispers, isotopic ratios that hint at biological fractionation of carbon, microscale structures that resemble microbial mats, subtle chemical patterns in ancient rocks. In places like the Iswa Greenstone Belt, collected samples of more than 3.5 billion years old bear carbon signatures that some interpret as signs of life. Elsewhere, stromatolitic structures, layered accretions created today by mats of microbes, appear in the rock record at around 3.5 billion years, and perhaps earlier. These traces are not photographs of an event, they are fingerprints and echoes, the kind of evidence that invites both awe and caution. Each claim of an early biosignature must be measured against the many ways abiotic chemistry can masquerade as life. Still, the accumulation of separate, consistent hints paints a persuasive picture. Life, in some form, was present remarkably early in Earth's history. It is easy, when contemplating such beginnings, to impose a narrative of linear progress. Chemistry becomes life, which becomes complexity, which becomes intelligence. But the Deep Time record resists such straightforward storytelling. Early life, once it appeared, existed in a world that would, for vast stretches, continue to be hostile. Large impacts could sterilize surfaces and remelt crusts. Ocean chemistry fluctuated. Atmospheric composition shifted. Yet life, once it found robust strategies, such as exploiting chemical gradients at vents or sheltering in subsurface niches, could endure through adversity. The persistence of life's whispers in the rock record suggests a stubbornness, a capacity not for purpose but for continuation under varying conditions. There is also a kind of poetic math in these origins. In the Black Oceans, iron precipitated out when oxygen later started to appear, leaving behind layered iron formations that narrate the planet's changing redox state. In the shallow pools, clay minerals folded in organics into ridges and pockets where reactions could be repeated and refined. In vents, mineral chimneys grew and collapsed, offering new microenvironments and experiments. Across these venues, time functioned as the patient editor. Countless failures were discarded, rare successes retained, and the handful of self-sustaining chemistries that could replicate and endure gradually accumulated complexity. The emotional undercurrent of these epochs, if emotion can be ascribed to a non-sentient planet, is one of fragile triumph. The Earth, enormous and indifferent, was raw and rearranging, yet within it there arose processes that would relentlessly accumulate history in a way no rock could. Life, at its inception, was a tiny, almost invisible factor in the planetary budget. Its chemical footprints were minute compared to the sweep of volcanic eruptions and asteroid impacts. But life had one property that rock did not. It could copy and thus persist in ways that non-living systems could not. Over eons, that property matters more than might be anticipated. The first replicators did not announce themselves with fanfare. They left subtle gradients, delicate structures, and later, the tidal stains of mats on the shallow margins. To the skeptical mind, these marks are ambiguous. To the imaginative mind, they are a beginning. That sense of beginning carries with it a particular kind of vertigo. The emergence of self-replication and rudimentary metabolism is an event that reorients history. What once was largely the domain of physics and chemistry becomes the domain of heredity and selection. The Earth's narrative gains a new axis, not just the motion of celestial bodies and the cooling of magma, but the story of entities that persist by copying themselves. The scale of that shift is hard to overstate. It redefines what counts as cause and effect on the planet. Small, local chemical systems now had the potential to leave legacies measurable across geological strata. And yet, even as life began to leave marks, it remained precarious. The same forces that enabled its birth could also erase it. Large impacts could reheat oceans, reset chemistry, and sterilize surfaces. Climate swings could render habitats inhospitable. The young moon's tidal forces, while beneficial for concentrating chemistry in shallow pools, also generated extreme mechanical stresses. The early biosphere. If the word biosphere is not yet too grand for its first microbial actors, likely consisted of scattered communities, each adapted to its niche, often isolated, sometimes lost. The story of the oceans and the first life, then, is a story of thresholds and probabilities. It is not destiny so much as opportunity. The planet's early conditions supplied a convergence of factors, volatiles, energy gradients, mineral catalysts, and a rhythm of environmental cycles that together created a space in which self-replicating chemistry could emerge. Once that chemistry found a foothold, even a tenuous one, the trajectory of the Earth changed in ways that would only become fully evident much later. In the long view, the first oceans are a prologue written in water. The first living systems are quiet actors, invisible to the naked eye, that nevertheless begin to rewrite the chemistry of their surroundings. The narrative of a planet shifts, subtly at first, then cumulatively, as selection sifts through molecular possibility. The record is fragmentary, the evidence cautious, and the interpretations inevitably speculative in places. But if one listens closely, across the noise of impacts and the hiss of ancient rain, there is a persistent theme. That from a world of molten rock and violent collisions emerged places where water could pool, where chemistry could grow in complexity, and where, in narrow niches and against tremendous odds, the first chapters of biology were written. The next acts of diversification, of ecological entanglement, of the slow march toward complexity, would be built upon the patient, wet experiments of this ancient sea. What does it mean for a world to learn to breathe? That question cleaves the long arc of planetary history into two very different acts. For billions of years, Earth's lungs were silent. Chemistry moved without the rhythm of respiration. Then, in the slow, patient laboratories of shallow seas and tidal flats, an unassuming class of organisms invented a trick that would change everything. They split light and water and, in doing so, began to make a new gas for the planet to carry. Those first photosynthesizers were not architects or poets, they were small, efficient chemists. Yet their cumulative work amounted to a planetary invention, a breath. The earliest hints of this transformation are quiet in the rocks, but loud in consequence. Tiny mats of microbes, cyanobacteria among them, carpeted sunlit surfaces, slick and glistening, forming layered structures that would later fossilize as stromatolites. In those layers, under the glare of a young sun, cells harvested photons and used them to extract electrons from water. The byproduct of that elegant chemistry was oxygen, once a rare and reactive ball of molecules that the planet had not had to carry in abundance. At first, oxygen was not freedom, it was a caustic insult. The newly produced oxygen reacted ferociously with the reduced minerals and dissolved iron that filled the oceans. Where iron met oxygen, rust formed at planetary scale. Vast, banded iron formations, the planet's geological journals, recorded the slow pairing of free oxygen with iron. Dark, iron-rich bands alternated with lighter silica layers, a layered testimony to chemical negotiations that stretched over millions of years. In those pages, the story reads clearly. Oxygen was being made, and the Earth was absorbing it. The production of oxygen did not immediately equate to an oxygenated sky. There were sinks to fill, reactions to exhaust, and a patient timetable during which the invisible bargain between biology and geology was settled. This patience is an important theme. Cyanobacteria did not set out to change the atmosphere, they pursued a habit that suited them. Each cell reproduced, arranged itself on a sunlit surface, and converted light into chemical potential. Yet, in aggregate and across uncountable generations, their activity shifted planetary chemistry. The oceans gradually lost their vast stores of dissolved reduced substances. When these sinks were filled, oxygen no longer had anywhere to go. It began to accumulate. That accumulation, slow, episodic, punctuated by setbacks and fluctuations, is what modern scientists call the Great Oxidation Event. It was not a single date in a calendar, but a protracted phase in which composition, climate, and redox equilibria rearranged themselves. The sky that had been thick with methane and other reducing gases turned slowly to a new mixture where oxygen would make a growing appearance. With oxygen came one of evolution's most consequential consequences, an energetic currency for metabolism that supports higher rates of activity and larger bodies. The shift did more than change breathing gases. Oxygen reacted with ultraviolet radiation at high altitudes, allowing the formation of an ozone layer, a tenuous shield that deflected the sun's worst ultraviolet flares. Sunlight still arrived with intensity, but the surface was no longer a direct blast of sterilizing photons. Instead, a narrow corridor opened where the architecture of complexity could assemble with greater safety. One can imagine the slow revolution on the seafloor. Microbial mats that had once monopolized shallow niches now contended with new chemistry. Some organisms adapted to exploit oxygen's energy yield. Others found niches in reducing microenvironments, holding on by the agility of metabolic flexibility. New partnerships formed, symbioses that stitched different metabolisms together. Eukaryotic cells with internal compartments and more elaborate biochemistry appear in the fossil record after these shifts. What had begun as simple, single-celled life quietly moved toward greater structural and functional complexity. There is an emotional texture to this transformation that is hard to express without anthropomorphism, yet broadly truthful. It felt, in geological terms, like a world learning a new trick and then being remade by it. The planet that once tolerated only slow, diffuse chemistry became permissive of rapid metabolic rates and more complicated anatomies. The environmental scaffolding that allowed larger, more active organisms to exist was not inevitable. It was the result of patient work by tiny cells. Millions, then hundreds of millions of years passed. Oceans oxygenated in patches, ecosystems diversified in parallel. Mats gave rise to biofilms. Proto-eukaryotes experimented with compartmentalization, and multicellularity emerged repeatedly in separate lineages. Each step was both tentative and decisive. When simple multicellular clumps succeeded in coordinating within a membrane, they could exploit environmental gradients and nutrient flows with unprecedented efficacy. The recipe for complexity required time, energy, and ecological opportunity, all of which the oxygenated seas increasingly provided. What followed at last reads like a crescendo in the deep record. Around 541 million years ago, the Cambrian explosion began not as a single instant, but as a torrent of innovation concentrated in marine environments. The oceans, long the arenas of earlier experimentation, now hosted a remarkable diversification of body plans. Mollusks, arthropods, early chordates, and an assortment of armored and soft-bodied forms appeared in the fossil record with a speed and richness that even modern paleontologists describe as explosive. This explosion was, in part, a consequence of the physics and chemistry earlier epochs had delivered. Higher oxygen levels made sustained muscular activity possible. Larger bodies could be built without prohibitive energetic costs. Nutrient cycles had stabilized enough to support complex food webs, but there were other ingredients. Genetic toolkits had grown more versatile, developmental pathways more malleable, and ecological interactions more intricate. Predation, once rare and rudimentary, emerged with new potency. The appearance of mouths and grasping appendages rewired selection pressures. Armor and shells followed an evolutionary response. The pressure of survival began to favor protection, mobility, and sensory refinement. One must linger over the first scenes of that undersea theatre. The Cambrian Ocean was a place of tension and invention. On soft, muddy plains, burrows began to lace through sediments as animals learned to exploit the three-dimensionality of substrate. The seafloor was no longer simply a passive stage. It became an ecosystem engineered by the organisms upon it. Grazers trimmed microbial lawns, filter feeders drew water through internal passages, predators prowled the margins and the open benthic plains. The advent of hard parts, mineralized shells and exoskeletons reshaped ecological dynamics. For the first time, predation left durable traces. fossils preserve not only soft impressions but robust records of armored life. Trilobites scuttled across the seafloor like living jewels, their segmented exoskeletons recording episodes of molting and growth. Early mollusks tucked themselves into protective shells or secreted hard plates that afforded both support and defense. Brachiopods anchored to sediments, their bivalved shells filtering the currents. And in the water column, creatures like anomalocaridids, enigmatic and formidable, patrolled as apex predators, suggesting that the arms race between hunter and hunted had become a defining ecological theme. That arms race had broader implications than immediate survival. Once defensive structures became advantageous, the genetic and developmental frameworks that produced mineralized tissues proliferated. Different lineages converged on similar solutions: armor, spines, streamlined bodies. Sensory systems also evolved rapidly under these pressures. Eyes, once simple light sensors, developed into lenses and multifaceted organs, taking advantage of abundant photons and clearer, oxygen-influenced waters. Mobility improved, nervous systems became more complex. The Cambrian seas increasingly resembled an ecosystem structured by interactions, not merely by individual organisms existing in isolation. Those interactions created pockets of relative stability, reefs, and communal assemblages that permitted further diversification. Reefs, constructed by early biomineralizing organisms, created habitats within habitats, adding vertical complexity and new niches. Niche partitioning reduced direct competition and allowed more species to coexist. Ecology, which had been a word with little meaning in the deep past, now became a dynamic tapestry of relationships. Yet the Cambrian moment was also fragile and contingent. Environmental shifts, regional differences in chemistry, and episodic events could and did prune evolutionary experiments. Extinctions were a constant companion. The fossil record is as much a catalogue of loss as of innovation. But the balance tipped sufficiently toward persistence. So many novel body plans took hold that the history of animals thereafter was profoundly altered. There is philosophical gravity in that transformation. For eons, only chemistry and geology seemed to matter. Then biological processes, powered in crucial part by oxygen produced by unassuming microbes, redirected the course of planetary change. Animals with guts and muscles and sensory faculties began to engineer the environment as much as it had engineered them. Bioturbation, the churning of sediments by burrowing animals, altered nutrient cycles. The oxygenation of shallow waters encouraged more aerobic metabolisms, which in turn increased the rates of biogeochemical cycling. Feedback loops emerged, life altered the environment, and the environment funneled selection. In the telling of this chapter, there is an abiding sense of smallness and mystery. The actors that changed the planet's breath were microscopic. The innovations that made possible trilobites and armored mollusks were often subtle shifts in metabolism. The acquisition of a gene regulation network here, a mineralizing pathway there. Deep time amplifies these tiny events into planetary consequences. The emotional center of the narrative is not drama in the human sense, but the awe of improbable cumulative change. Simple cells, through patient repetition of chemistry, produced a gas that would allow animals to pursue movement, sensation, and complexity. This is not inevitability masquerading as destiny. Evolution is variation and chance constrained by physical reality. The oxygenation of the oceans might have taken different pathways. The Cambrian radiation might have unfolded differently under other contingencies. Yet the actual pathway, messy and contingent, produced an outcome of remarkable fecundity. It is a humility-inducing fact. The architecture of complex life rested on a foundation of microbial diligence and on the slow correction of geochemical imbalances. In the memory of rocks and in the subtle isotopic signatures of ancient strata, the story remains legible. Banded iron formations tell of oxygen's early conflict with iron. Stromatolites preserve layered evidence of microbial citizenship in coastal ecosystems. Fossils of the Cambrian preserve sudden, explosive diversity, shells, spines, eyes, and the first convincing bones of a nervous life. These records are fragmentary and interpretative, yet they converge to narrate a world that moved from chemical experimentation to a milieu alive with interaction. For a planet learning to breathe, the Cambrian explosion is a declaration of possibility. It is not the last word. Later chapters will bring terrestrial invasions, forests, vertebrates, and, in time, reflective minds asking questions about their own origins. But in that undersea epoch, the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. The planet's narrative gained actors with the capacity to respond, move, and shape. The story of Earth, once written in the slow hand of physics and chemistry alone, now included a new pen. Life itself, iterating, experimenting, and persistently altering the stage upon which it played. When the narrator steps back and listens across the gulf of time, there is a particular hush that follows such epochs of rearrangement. The Cambrian seas quieted and reconfigured after their burst of innovation, but remained transformed. The atmosphere, the oceans, and the interplay of life and rock continued to exchange influence. And somewhere in that exchange, the seeds of further complexity, ecosystems, trophic networks, and evolutionary creativity were sown. The planet that had once been a molten, indifferent sphere had learned, through the unostentatious work of microbes and the later flourish of armored and soft-bodied animals, to host a richer array of being. It was a slow lesson in planetary plasticity, that small, persistent processes can, over eons, rewrite the face of a world. What does a world do with its dead? That question might seem macabre until one recognizes that in deep time, the collapse of one form is often the scaffolding of another's ascent. In the sediments of ancient seas, in the soft beds of tidal flats, in the slow compost of washed-up remains, the bodies of creatures, trilobite carapaces, the spongy skeletons of simple sessile animals, the drifting flesh of small worms and arthropods, became the raw material of new environments. Their corpses were not mere endings. They were catalysts, nutrients, carbon stores, and, eventually, the first hints that a planet could convert demise into habitat. In the wake of the Cambrian multiplicity came increasing specialization. Sponges, among the most ancient of animal lineages, continued their quiet work. Their porous bodies, tuned to filter the ocean, left traces both living and fossilized. Tiny skeletal spicules that littered the seafloor, that cemented as part of reef frameworks. Sponges did not move much, nor did they aspire. Their success was architectural and biochemical. A life lived as circulation, as the transformation of passing water into the slow accrual of biomass. When sponges died, their mineral remains accumulated in hollows and ramps, becoming micro-relief on which other organisms settled. The reef, in all its layered resilience, was as much a library of death as of life. Trilobites, by contrast, were the spectacle of 1,000 seafloor dramas. Their segmented armor, often mineralized with calcite, meant that their carapaces endured. Trilobite corpses accumulated in shelters, in anoxic troughs where scavengers were scarce, and those quiet accumulations fossilized into the fossil record that so enthralls modern eyes. But these carapaces were more than paleontological curiosities. They were evidence of an evolutionary turning point. Many trilobites possessed compound eyes, arrays of calcite lenses, fixed and crystalline, each lens a window onto a pixel of a movement-rich world. Those eyes were not like ours. They were sculpted by mineral chemistry and optical physics, the earliest examples of what complex vision could be. Through them, predators and prey negotiated a new ecological vocabulary: detection, evasion, pursuit. The emergence of eyes and nervous systems is a story of increment and consequence. It began, in its most rudimentary sense, with light-sensitive cells that registered day and night, dawn and dusk. A simple photosensitive patch could inform an organism whether to surface or hide. Over evolutionary generations, that patch deepened into a cup, and the cup refined into a lens or layered facets. Nervous systems drew a parallel arc from diffuse nerve nets, networks that registered local changes and coordinated simple contractions, to centralized ganglia and longitudinal nerve cords capable of integrating sensory input and producing directed movement. In bilaterian animals, the trend was towards cephalization, the concentration of sensory organs and processing centers at one end of the body. This was not an act of design, but of iterative advantage. Where information concentrates, organisms could act faster and with more coordination. Predation intensified, so did escape. With vision sharpening and circuits centralizing, the sea's ecological theatre grew more elaborate. Mobile hunters evolved appendages and jaws, prey developed armor and burrowing strategies. Each innovation was a ripple across ecosystems, and each death, the smashed trilobite carapace, the sponge skeleton, the shredded worm, returned nutrients to sediments. Those sediments, when exposed at low tides or washed ashore during storms, became patches of detritus. These tidal margins and strand lines were, in a sense, the planet's first shoreline laboratories, places where marine supplies met air and where, across a narrow interface, the conditions for terrestrial life would someday germinate. The conquest of land did not begin with lungs or limbs so much as with chemistry and attachment. Mossy mats and algal films clung to damp rocks in the shallows long before true plants stood tall. The earliest colonists were not imposing, but opportunistic, simple photosynthetic organisms that could tolerate desiccation and UV exposure. Their presence on whetstones created microenvironments where dust accumulated and chemical weathering intensified. Where spores or fragments cremated by waves caught in crevices, they brought organic matter into contact with mineral surfaces. Over time, the accumulation of decayed algal mats and the trapping of sediments produced the thinnest of protosoils. Crucially, fungi, silent partners in the terrestrial saga, were among the first to establish mutualistic footholds beyond the surf. Mycorrhizal relationships, intimate biochemical liaisons between fungi and plant tissues, became the means by which nascent plants drew nutrients from mineral substrates. The fungal filaments invaded rock microfractures, weathering minerals and delivering phosphorus and other scarce elements to photosynthetic partners. In return, the plants fed the fungi with carbohydrates. This partnership accelerated soil formation. With each season, each generation, the lattice of living and dead organic material thickened. The Devonian landscape, 400 to 360 million years ago, could be read as a slow bloom. Early vascular plants, Cooksonia and its kin, began to erect rudimentary stems and spore-producing structures. These first land plants possessed conducting tissues that moved water and sugars, a primitive plumbing that allowed vertical growth, however modest. They developed cuticles to reduce water loss and stomata to exchange gases selectively. Roots, or root-like rhizomes, penetrated sediments, binding loose grains and drawing minerals into living cycles. The effect was not instantaneous, but cumulative. In sheltered coastal flats and estuaries, carpets of green extended, trapping silt and creating peat-like deposits. Peat, in turn, would one day be coal. But before it was fossil fuel, it was ecology in progress. Layer upon layer of plant detritus, compressed by water and time, formed thick beds of organic muck. These beds retained moisture, fostering microbial and fungal activity and altering local redox conditions. Through this slow engineering of landscapes, the atmosphere itself felt a pressure. Habitats that had been inhospitable, exposed mudflats, ephemeral pools, shallow saline lagoons, grew stable niches where both plants and animals could experiment with life beyond water. The animals that accepted the invitation to step closer to air were not grand pioneers in the heroic sense. Many were arthropods, arachnids, myriapods, early hexapods that had already conquered the littoral and damp, leaf-litter environments. These creatures adapted to the challenges of desiccation with exoskeletons that reduced water loss and internal designs that balanced respiration with the risk of drying. They were the first to make the land their dominion, grazing on the emerging green carpet, fragmenting detritus and converting plant matter into feces and carcasses that fed soils. The arthropods were ecological engineers and, in death, became nutrient inputs for the very plants their living counterparts consumed. Meanwhile, in the shallows, a different story unfolded: the gradual transformation of lobe-finned fishes into the earliest amphibious tetrapods. The lobe-finned fishes, Sarcopterygiae, carried within their robust fins the skeletal blueprint of limbs. These fins were muscular and jointed, with bones that foreshadowed humerus, radius, ulna, femur, tibia, and fibula. In certain environments, stagnant pools, oxygen-poor swamps, these fishes possessed lungs or air-breathing adaptations that allowed survival when oxygen dissolved in water dwindled. They learned to gulp air, to use their swim bladders in respiratory roles, and to maneuver across shallow substrates with their lobed fins. One can imagine the scene without ascribing intent: a shallow, vegetation-strewn pool, warmed by the sun, slowly losing water to heat. Its water grows hypoxic. Fish that can breathe air find an advantage. Pushed by seasonal drying or by the pursuit of food, some individuals begin to use their fins against the soft mud, propping themselves up, exploring the fringe where water meets land. The evolutionary steps that followed were neither rapid nor linear. A sequence of small morphological changes, reinforced limb bones, modified joints, stronger pectoral and pelvic girdles, changes in the skull and neck that allowed the head to lift, accumulated across generations. The early tetrapods, such as Acanthostiga and Ichthyostiga, retains clear aquatic traits, gills and tail fins while bearing limbs with digits. They were amphibious in the most literal sense, bounded to both water and land, using each as conditions permitted. Respiration across the water. Air divide required physiological innovation. Lungs became more efficient, and systems for regulating internal water balance evolved. The skin, no longer perpetually surrounded by water, developed ways to reduce evaporation, mucus coatings, behavioral retreats into humid microhabitats, nocturnality. These were all patterned responses. Reproduction, however, remained tied to aquatic settings. Eggs without desiccation, resistant shells demanded moist or aquatic sites for development. Thus, the early amphibians were still chained to water for their young, an ecological constraint that shaped life histories and behaviors. As plants grew taller and denser, and as soils deepened, the terrestrial environment opened a multiplicity of niches: forested wetlands of the Carboniferous, vast coal-forming swamps, harbored towering lycophytes, horsetails, and primitive ferns. Their roots and trunks sequestered carbon, their fallen bodies contributed to thick organic layers, and their canopies altered microclimates below. The proliferation of terrestrial plant biomass had an atmospheric consequence: the drawdown of carbon dioxide and the concomitant rise in oxygen. Oxygen levels in the late Carboniferous may have been appreciably higher than today, fueling the gigantism seen in some arthropods of the era. Environments became more intricate, more oxygen-rich, and more hospitable to sustained activity. The fossil record of these epochs is a ledger where success and failure coexist. The imprints of trilobite corpses, the spicule fragments of sponges, the flattened forms of plant stems, the limb bones of early tetrapods. They are preserved narratives of trial, of persistence, and of loss. Each peat seam is a chronicle of life, piled upon life, compacted into a future that would one day power industrial societies and reveal to curious investigators the deep entanglement of death and creation. There is a moral, if one will it, in this geological bookkeeping. The conquest of land was neither a single march nor an inevitable graduation. It was a series of contingent experiments mediated by chemistry, anatomy, and environmental chance. Vision and nervous centralization in the seas set the stage for more intricate behaviors. Those behaviors reshaped everything: predation structures, habitats, burrowing aerated soils and changed nutrient cycles, carcasses enriched substrates, plants stabilized sediments and altered climates. The early amphibians were neither triumphant conquerors nor maladapted wanderers. They were the temporary solutions that enabled ecosystems to expand their repertoire. Emotion in deep time is a precarious word, but there is an affective texture to this age. The tension between fragility and robustness, the suspense of niches waiting for the right combination of traits, the elegiac rhythm of bodies falling only to nourish future complexity. The land was not simply taken, it was coaxed into being by the slow accretion of organic labor. By sponges filtering, trilobites moving, plants binding, fungi infiltrating, fungi and plants cooperating, and fishes learning to wring oxygen from the air. Death was both ledger and currency. The planet learned to invest the remains of the old in the wealth of the new. When the narrative pauses on the threshold of 300 million years ago, the scene is both unfamiliar and strangely resonant. Forests stood where there had been mudflats. Soils were thick enough to support complex root networks. Arthropods ruled leaf litter and canopy alike. Amphibians scuttled and hunted in wetlands, their forms still fish-like yet being slowly rewired for life that sometimes continued beyond the edge of water. The air smelled, in the geological imagination, of resin and peat, of decaying leaves and oxygen-rich breath. A different planet from the one that had first been water-laden and oxygen-poor. The conquest of land, then, is less a victory song than an accretional poem, composed of corpses and spicules, of the slow refinement of sight and nervous organization, of mineralized eyes that watched and nervous cords that coordinated, of fungal filaments and primitive roots that wrestled rock into soil, and of lobe-finned fishes that in their persistence became the heralds of limbs. It is a chapter where endings effloresce into beginnings, where the residue of sea life becomes the substrate for terrestrial innovation. To read it is to witness a world learning a new way of existing, step by small, contingent step on the solid embrace of land. What does it feel like when life finally masters the gravity of air? Imagine a sky grown thick with oxygen, a world where the simple physics of diffusion is suddenly generous enough to let arthropods balloon into shapes that would astonish a modern eye. Picture a coastline lined with shallow, sun-warmed pools, the margins braided by green mats, and the occasional awkward silhouettes of creatures that still carried the memory of fins in their bones. That image is a hinge between water and land, a hinge upon which whole ecologies turned, and a hinge that, in deep time, changed what it meant to be animal. The first tetrapods that shuffled and stumbled out of water were not triumphant heroes. They were experiments of anatomy and circumstance, mosaics of traits honed for life that was still half aquatic. Ichthyostega and its contemporaries are names that echo through the fossil record like footfalls in an empty corridor. Creatures with sturdy limb bones braced against swamps, with broad, flat skulls and nostrils that could sample air. Animals whose wrists and ankles bore the crude geometry of digits. Their limbs were not yet optimized for long marches across dry land. Instead, they were instruments of negotiation, for propping up the body in shallow water, dragging across soft substrates, levering into pockets of food where water once kept others away. Anatomically, these pioneers revealed the compromises inherent in the first terrestrial sorties. Their ribs expanded to support lungs under the force of gravity, shoulder and pelvic girdles strengthened to transmit push and pull to a body now contending with its own weight. The skulls changed. Eyes shifted upward or laterally to see across the surface, while the lateral line system, so useful in water for sensing currents, diminished or altered in function. Lungs became more central to gas exchange, even as skin and the lining of the throat continued to participate in respiratory duties. Reproduction, however, remained tethered. Eggs still required water, or at least perpetually moist microhabitats. The earliest amphibious lineages could only venture so far from a puddle without risking the next generation. While tetrapods were negotiating the narrow margins between salt and soil, the world's atmosphere and flora conspired to produce the otherworldly phenomenon, insect gigantism. The Carboniferous period was a time when the global breath, atmospheric oxygen, swelled to levels perhaps 30–35%, significantly higher than today's 21%. In such an atmosphere, the constraints that normally limit the size of tracheal-breathing arthropods loosened. Diffusion through internal air channels worked more efficiently. The cost of moving oxygen along a narrow tube was reduced. The result was an ecology crisscrossed by living things that used air in a way contemporary descendants seldom can imagine. In the coal swamps, dragonfly-like insects the size of modern gulls patrolled the humid air. Meganeura, with wingspans exceeding 2/3 of a meter, folded and flicked through a world of tall lycophytes and fragile branches. Terrestrial arthropods like Arthropleura, a millipede kin the length of a human leg, ground through leaf litter, a massed scroll of segments and legs that chewed and compacted plant detritus into the substrata of future coal. These giants were not merely curiosities, they structured food webs, preyed upon and were preyed upon, and became agents in the turnover of biomass that built paleosoils and peat beds. The visual tableau of a carboniferous swamp is cinematic and strange. Forests of club mosses, tree ferns, and horsetails surging to heights unfamiliar to earlier epochs, their trunks repeating a limited lexicon of vascular architecture, but doing so in mass. The ground underfoot was soft and saturated, a carpet thick with half-decayed organic matter. Decomposition ran slowly under waterlogged, anoxic conditions, so biomass accumulated in astonishing quantities. Those beds of partially decomposed plants, compressed by water and time, would become the coal seams that geologists cut through millions of years later. In steaming subtropical heat and high oxygen, life grew in botanical abundance and in arthropodal scale. Skies and understories were full. Yet the proficiency of life for a time does not imply permanence. The end of the Carboniferous and the dawn of the Permian were moments of ecological and climatic tightening. the planet's continents continued to migrate, drawing toward a colossal union, Pangaea. This continental coalescence altered climate and hydrology. Interior regions of the supercontinent grew seasonally dry, monsoonal belts expanded, and the vast humid coal swamps retreated as seed-bearing plants better adapted to fluctuation and aridity took hold. With these changing contexts came an evolutionary key, the amniotic egg. The appearance of embryos, encased not only in membranes but also in shells, leathery or calcareous, marks one of the most consequential innovations in vertebrate history. The amniote egg is not merely a physical container, it is an ecological liberation. Within its membranes, the amnion cushioning the embryo in a fluid bath, the chorion allowing gas exchange, the allantois storing wastes and also participating in respiration, and the yolk providing a dense, portable store of nourishment. The embryo could complete more of its development away from water. Fertilization became internal in many lineages, and reproductive sites no longer had to be ponds or marshes. The terrestrial world, including its arid interiors, was now open for colonization in ways previously impossible. This innovation precipitated a major phylogenetic split among amniotes. Those lineages that would lead to mammals on one side, the synapsids, and those that would radiate into the diverse reptilian clades on the other, the sauropsids. In the Permian landscape, these groups explored divergent solutions to the perennial problem of life away from water. Skin grew thicker and more cornified in many forms, scales and scutes provided physical protection and reduced water loss. Kidneys and excretory strategies refined the retention of salts and water. Behavioral repertoires changed. Burrowing, nocturnality, and seasonal dormancy became strategies to navigate the new dryness. The Age of Reptiles, as this span of time is sometimes named, is often imagined through shiny icons, sail-backed predators, armored herbivores, the nascent contours of dinosaurs. But the actual story of 300 to 205 million years ago is more complex and more intimate. The Permian saw the proliferation of pelycosaurs and their successors, the therapsids, whose skulls and teeth foreshadowed mammalian trends. It saw early archosauriforms probing their niches, the early experiments that would one day spawn crocodilians and, much later, dinosaurs. Each lineage was a trial in the management of heat, the budgeting of water, and the negotiation of food resources in increasingly seasonal climes. Paleo-environments responded in parallel. The vast wet forests gave way regionally to gymnosperm-dominated scrublands, conifers, chordates, and seed ferns that could disperse and establish in porous soils and through drier seasons. These plants altered the character of soils and altered fire regimes. Higher oxygen levels had once made spontaneous burning more likely. As oxygen moderated and climates dried in many places, fires became periodic sculptors of vegetation, clearing, resetting competitive hierarchies, and favoring resilience traits in plants and animals alike. In such a world, small, shelled eggs could be hidden in sandy hollows or nested beneath vegetation, safe from desiccation and extracted from the immediate perils of predatory fish. The vertebrates themselves orchestrated new ecological rhythms. Herbivory intensified as tooth plates and grinding surfaces evolved to process tougher plant matter. The comparative anatomy of jaws and teeth began to reflect diets more diverse than anything seen in earlier epochs. Predation became more complex. Jaws could deliver crushing forces. Postures shifted from sprawling to more erect gaits in some lineages, increasing locomotor efficiency. Sensory systems refined as nocturnal and burrowing lifestyles proliferated. Olfaction and tactile faculties acquired prominence where vision was constrained by gloom or sand-choked air. The world's biotic networks became intricate assemblages of producers, consumers, and decomposers, each looping into the others through subtler forms of resource exchange than the earlier aquatic regimes. There was an emotional tenor to these shifts that the rocks quietly preserve, the sense of a planet narrowing in some respects and opening in others. Where once broad, saturated habitats allowed for gigantism and luxuriant decomposition, the formation of Pangaea introduced stresses that favored economical designs and reproductive autonomy. The amniot strategy is the materialization of that economy, investing more in each offspring to afford life beyond the aquatic cradle. In that investment lie future dividends. Without the tether to water, vertebrate lineages could diversify across continental interiors, into deserts and mountain basins, into higher latitudes, seasonally variable and unpredictable. But the age of reptiles is also a prologue to catastrophe. The Permian ends not with a quiet handover, but with the most severe mass extinction in Earth's history. At about 252 million years ago, the record flips, ecosystems collapse, biodiversities plummet, and a planetary turning point occurs. The causes are debated and manifold in their probable contribution. Rapid volcanic outpourings such as the Siberian traps, greenhouse gas surges, ocean anoxia, and cascading ecological feedbacks. Whatever the proximate mechanisms, the result was an erasure so profound that whole branches of experimentation were culled. Yet in the attrition there was also a sifting. The survivors carried forward the innovations of the Permian, amniot, egg, scales, new metabolic strategies, and these would scaffold the radiations of the Mesozoic that followed. The arc from Ichthyostega's hesitant steps to the amniotic egg and the reptile's terrestrial sovereignty is a narrative of constraint lifted and constraint reformed. Early tetrapods required water for their young. Amniotes did not. High oxygen permitted outsized bodies in arthropods. Declining oxygen and drying climates reduced that possibility and reshaped the atmospheric theatre. The evolutionary toolkit expanded. Membranes, shells, tougher skin, and internal fertilization are technological changes in an ancient sense, solutions to the material problem of life away from the sea. Those adaptations were neither inevitable nor teleological. They were contingent responses to particular combinations of climate, landscape, and competition. To stand back from this deep time choreography is to feel the peculiar mixture of smallness and profundity. The anatomical changes that allowed creatures to lift themselves onto land were minute. The reshaping of a bone here, the modification of a respiratory surface there, yet their cumulative effect was planetary. The invention of the egg with its protective membranes is at once a biological curiosity and an ecological rupture. It rewrote the rules of reproduction and dispersed life into geographic margins previously uninhabitable. The age of reptiles, with all its experimentation, was an interval in which life learned to be less dependent on the wetness of its origin. And yet the narrator returns to a cautionary note: these triumphs are always offset by contingency. Geological forces can compress eons into abrupt crises. Climatic swings can prune diversity with ruthless efficiency. The Permian's close is a reminder that innovations, however transformative, can be swallowed by planetary scale events. In the ledger of deep time, the story of Ichthyostega's kind and of the reptiles that followed is a stanza, arresting, instructive, necessary, and ultimately provisional. When the soundstage of this epoch falls quiet, what remains is both a record and a question. The bones, the coal seams, the shell fragments, all are traces of an Earth in dynamic transition. They show how life tested the solid world, how it used oxygen and membranes and scales to negotiate aridity, and how it, briefly, dominated environments once foreign to its aquatic ancestors. The narrative does not promise a destination, it offers instead a model of possibility. In the great theatre of Earth, life improvises with the materials at hand, sometimes inventing solutions that last for hundreds of millions of years, sometimes losing them to forces beyond any organism's control. The age of reptiles is a demonstration of both the capacity of life to innovate and the sobering fact that innovation does not guarantee permanence. What does it feel like when the architecture of an entire world is suddenly put on trial? This is the question that hangs over the end of the Permian. Not merely what species live or die, but what happens when the scaffolding of ecosystems, the chains of energy, the balances of chemistry, the weathering rhythms of land and sea snap under forces that are part geologic, part atmospheric, and all but incomprehensible in human terms. For tens of millions of years before that collapse, life had crafted its own hierarchies. Among the most striking of these were the synapsid predators, the so-called mammal-like reptiles that patrolled floodplains, riverbanks, and swamp margins. Dimetrodon, with its distinctive sail, has become an emblem of an era. It was not a dinosaur. It belonged to a lineage that would ultimately feed into the long story of mammal ancestry. Yet in its day, Dimetrodon and its kin were apex predators, the living proof that evolution can produce instruments of predation from very different starting points. To watch a Dimetrodon in the Permian mindscape is to witness a study in physiological negotiation. Its sail, an extended array of neural spines connected by skin, was humbly theatrical in purpose. In the cool mornings that followed storm-laden nights, the sail tilted to the sun, blood coursing through its membranes warmed or cooled, and the animal adjusted its internal temperature with a calm, deliberate choreography. Later, in the heat of an equatorial day, the sail could be angled to shed excess warmth. This was not vanity, but thermoregulation, a living radiator tuned to the constraints of a terrestrial world in which the balance between energy intake and expenditure dictated survival. Dimetrodon's hunting was a composite of patience and sudden violence. It lingered in reed, choked shallows and along riverbanks, nostrils twitching for the scent of water-sodden prey. Its prey were often amphibian and reptilian forms that still carried memory of aquatic life. Broad-bodied temnospondyls and early diapsids, creatures that fed on fish, on smaller tetrapods, on the detritus of rich wetland systems. When opportunity presented, a Dimetrodon would lunge with a torque of the torso, teeth designed to slice and crush, finding purchase in soft tissue. Carcasses were eaten with efficiency, bones cracked, marrow extracted, and nothing wasted. In death, their remains fed detritivores and the microbial networks in the soils, folding one life into the next. Across the floodplain, a dynamic economy of nutrition and decay had matured. Predators, prey, scavengers, decomposers, each a thread in an interdependent web. The landscape these animals inhabited was not unchanging. It had been shaped by a long history of continental drift that gathered land into Pangaea, producing vast interior basins whose climates could swing from humid to parched. Riparian belts hosted thick vegetation in places, seed ferns and early conifers that formed the backbone of terrestrial ecosystems. Nearer the coasts, coal-forming swamps persisted, and in those soggy shelves a different caste of arthropods and amphibians prospered, some reaching surprising sizes in an atmosphere rich in oxygen. It is precisely in the rhythm and redundancy of these systems that the tragedy of the Great Dying is best understood. The extinction at the Permian-Triassic boundary was not a single creature's misfortune. It was the unmaking of ecological furniture everywhere: forests, reefs, microbial mats, burrows and soils, the myriad niches that had been assembled by millions of years of biotic construction. at around 252 million years ago, the script of life was interrupted with an intensity that still stimulates debate. The primary agent, widely implicated, is an enormous volcanic event, the Siberian Traps, where flood basalt eruptions blanketed millions of square kilometers in successive lava flows. The magnitude of those eruptions is almost difficult to grasp. They released prodigious amounts of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other volatiles into the atmosphere, and these emissions upset the delicate redox and thermal balances that had been quietly maintained for ages. The initial atmospheric assault had immediate and cascading effects. Sulfur aerosols and acid rain stripped nutrients from soils and poisoned freshwater habitats, while CO2 drove up global temperatures over geologic time. The seas, which had been relatively well-mixed reservoirs of life, began to stratify. Surface waters warmed and became less oxygenated, oxygen being a precious solute that declines sharply with temperature. Deeper layers, cut off from mixing, became places of suffocating anoxia where sulfide could accumulate, an environment lethal to most metazoan life. This is the anatomy of collapse, writ at planetary scale. Primary producers, phytoplankton, and photosynthetic microbes suffered from changes in light penetration and acidity and from the disruption of nutrient cycles. When phytoplankton populations slump, the very base of the marine food web weakens. Zooplankton dwindled. Fish and larger invertebrates lost their primary food sources. Predators like marine reptiles and large bony fishes found prey scarcer, and oxygen-poor waters sapped the energy needed for fast locomotion and efficient respiration. On land, plant dieback reduced habitat complexity and food supply, triggering failures in herbivore populations that cascaded into predators. The fossil record registers these losses bluntly. Reefs collapse, shelled organisms decline dramatically, and entire clades vanish. The speed and severity of these changes varied by region. Some habitats likely flickered with life for a few millennia longer than others. But the statistical picture is stark. Something on the order of 90 to 95% of marine species went extinct, and a similarly catastrophic fraction of terrestrial life was culled, including many of the large synapsids that had dominated Permian landscapes. The world did not die in the instant of an eruption. Its living networks were slowly strangled by a compounding of stresses, heat, anoxia, acidification, and the disintegration of trophic integrity. Visualizing this crash through a sensory lens adds a grim texture. Imagine rivers drying into muddy veins, the air thick with the sulfurous sting of acid clouds. Imagine coastal shallows reeking with the odor of decaying biomass as algal blooms collapse and dead zones expand. Imagine forest canopies thinning, then falling, the detritus decomposing in a warmer, more microbial-dominated regime that released yet more carbon and methane feedback loops, amplifying the catastrophe. It is a vision of a planet reconfiguring its chemistry and, in doing so, rendering obsolete a vast proportion of the life that had been adapted to the former balance. Yet extinction is not uniformly annihilative. It is more accurate to think of mass extinctions as massive filters, immediate and indiscriminate in scope, but consequential in selectivity. Some organisms perished because they could not tolerate heat or relies on oxygen-rich waters. Others survived because their ecologies were flexible or because they occupied refugia. Environments buffered from global change. Microbial communities adapted to anoxia proliferated. Small, burrowing, generalist animals, organisms with broad diets and high reproductive rates, proved more resilient. Plants with hardy seed strategies and animals that could estivate or exploit marginal resources persisted. The survivors of the Permian catastrophe did not merely endure. They became the raw material for a planetary second act. by stripping away dominant clades and collapsing ecospace. The extinction event opened evolutionary and ecological opportunities. Ecosystems that had been tightly constructed were now empty frames where novel architectures could be built. Over the tens of millions of years that followed, this large-scale culling reshaped the trajectory of life. Into those newly unoccupied niches stepped lineages that had weathered the crisis. Among them, early archosauromorphs and various reptilian clades poised to diversify. Archosaurs, an emergent group that included crocodile-line and bird-line descendants, began to exploit the vacant roles left by extinct competitors. Small diapsids evolved, new feeding strategies, arboreal habits, and locomotor capacities. In the Triassic, the stage was set for the rise of dinosaurs, though their ascendancy was incremental and contingent upon an array of ecological and environmental circumstances. It was not immediate triumph, but an extended experiment in adaptive radiation. At the same time, other groups, some descendants of synapsids that survived in reduced form, rebounded and radiated along lines that would eventually culminate in mammaliforms. The deep memory of the Permian's rich synapsid assemblages was not entirely erased. Fragments and lineages persisted, carrying with them anatomical and metabolic strategies that would be repurposed and refined across the Mesozoic. What the Great Dying ultimately accomplished was a reset that emphasized flexibility over specialization. The wall of extinction favored opportunistic life histories, small body size, high fecundity, broad diets, and physiological plasticity. It favored those lineages whose evolutionary portfolios contained the right codes for persistence under volatility. Over geological time, these opportunists explored morphologies and ecologies that would later build complex, sometimes gigantic forms. Dinosaurs among them. When conditions permitted new forms of dominance, there is a philosophical rhythm to the aftermath of such deep-time cataclysm. Catastrophe prunes, but it also prees, it dissolves old constraints and thereby alters the probability landscape of future evolution. The Mesozoic world that rose, one of soaring reptiles, marine behemoths, and eventually feathered dinosaurs, was both a consequence of past catastrophe and a product of contingency. The survivors carried the legacy of endurance, DNA sequences, sensory architectures, metabolic pathways that had been tested by the Permian crucible. This history offers a cautioned humility. Deep time teaches that dominance is provisional. The long reign of Dimetrodon-like synapsids, formidable, well-adapted, was no guarantee of permanence. Geological processes, volcanic effusion, atmospheric upheaval, ocean chemistry overturn can erase the artifacts of long terrestrial success. Yet the same forces that eliminate can also forge new ecologies. Life, at planetary scales, is a pattern of construction and deconstruction, of niches built and niches collapsed, of lineages tested and lineages reborn. The Permian-Triassic boundary thus stands as a testimony to both fragility and possibility. It was the most severe extirpation recorded in the Phanerozoic fossil record, an event that emptied vast portions of the planet's ecological agenda. But it was also the prelude to an era where different experiments in form and function played out across continents and seas. The dinosaurs and giant reptiles that later dominated did so in a world reassembled on the skeleton of the old, their eventual ascent framed by the scars of the Great Dying. In the end, a sobering image remains: the Earth, indifferent to the lives it supports, rearranging chemistry and climate through processes that extend beyond the comprehension of any single species. For a time, ecosystems align and stabilize. For a time, particular forms proliferate. Then a planetary perturbation can annihilate the familiar and clear a rough canvas. It is in those blank spaces after the silence that life small, opportunistic, persistent, begins again to write its long narrative. What does it mean for a world, freshly stitched back together after a cataclysm, to hand its future to a new suite of shapes and strategies? The question is less about dramatic conquest than about patient experimentation. Small, restless lineages pressing at the edges of possibility, recomposing ecology by trial and time. From this perspective, the age of dinosaurs is not merely an era of spectacle, it is a long negotiation between form and environment, a century-spanning laboratory where survivors and their descendants tested new anatomies, new ecologies, and new modes of being on a planet that had already learned how to surprise. Triassic. The first acts are modest. The world, still rearranging after the Permian purge, was a patchwork of recovering ecosystems. Pangaea's vast interior produced broad seasonal swings, river corridors, and rift valleys. Fractures in the crust offered juicy oases amid expanses of dry, scrubby ground. It is in these marginal, changeable places that early dinosaurs first appeared, small, bipedal creatures, lithe and often lightly built, whose very success lay in nimbleness and metabolic agility rather than sheer mass. They were not yet the rulers. The Triassic stage was an ecological marketplace crowded by experiments. Crocodilomorphs paddling and then scuttling into semi-terrestrial niches, rhynchosaurs and armored herbivores bulk feeding in low-lying wetlands, the first mammaliforms skulking nocturnally in leaf litter, small and insulated against daytime heat. Dinosaurs in this climate often occupied narrow niches, fast runners that foraged on insects and small vertebrates, or opportunistic omnivores that balanced speed and intelligence. Their teeth, limb proportions, and pelvic structure show a lineage exploring bipedality and a more active metabolism. Protofeathers, simple filamentous structures, begin to appear in some theropod lineages, not as instruments of flight, but as insulation, display, or both. Such details are the quiet scaffolding of later grandeur. The Triassic world had a certain tension to it, a planet simultaneously rebuilding and constraining. Survivorship favored flexibility. Many creatures were small because smallness is a buffer. It requires fewer resources and increases the chances of hiding or burrowing when extreme conditions returned. The early dinosaurs' resolve was not ambition but persistence. An opportunistic persistence that, when paired with continental fragmentation and ecological openings, would allow them to diversify spectacularly. Jurassic. The center stage darkens into scale and volume. As the Jurassic dawned, Pangaea continued its dissolution. Sea levels rose, rifts filled, corridors opened between formerly isolated basins. The planet warmed and greening surged. Towering conifers, cycads, and ferns-clad floodplains and coastal lowlands. In this more forgiving world, the experiments of the Triassic found room to escalate. Here, the colossal sauropods evolved, long-necked, pillar-limbed behemoths, diplodocus, brachiosaurus-like forms, moving as living tectonics across the landscape. Their necks were not simply spectacle. They were long, mobile feeding devices that allowed access to dispersed foliage and to an ecological strategy based on volume. Sauropods ate enormous quantities of plant material, and their digestive throughput reshaped the chemistry of soils and waterways. Vast herds, migrating in seasonal circuits, enabled long-distance seed dispersal and the creation of paths and clearings that smaller animals would exploit. The biomechanical economy of their bodies, lightened by air sacs in vertebrae, supported by columnar limbs, speaks to an evolutionary calculus that balanced gigantism with metabolic efficiency. Predators likewise grew into roles that matched the herbivores. Allosaurus and its kin prowled Jurassic woodlands, ambushes, and pursued predators with jaws and claws adapted to large prey. Their presence sculpted behavior in herbivore herds, flocks, and profiles of vigilance, the evolution of size and sometimes defensive groupings. Predator and prey co-evolved in a tense, iterative dance. Teeth sharpened, horns or plates emerged, and social behaviors. Cooperative hunting, herding, alarm calls left traces in bone and trackway. The skies also changed. Pterosaurs, masters of membrane flight, filled aerial niches from fish-eating coastal skim feeders to inland soarers. Their wings, forged of skin stretched over elongated fingers, show mechanical ingenuity. Creatures that exploited lift, thermals, and coastal updrafts to become consummate flyers. In parallel, the first true birds, evolutionary offshoots of small maniraptoran theropods, appeared as feathered arboreal experimenters. Archaeopteryx-like forms combined teeth, claws, and feathered wings, offering a glimpse of flight's long, incremental assembly. Feathers evolving for insulation and display, later repurposed for aerodynamic control. The Jurassic, then, is a world in which scale and agility coexist. Titans that reshape forests pace alongside agile flyers that presage modern birds. Marine realms were no less theatrical. Ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and large pliosaurs hunted in the sea, their forms adapted to fulsome aquatic predation. Their presence underlines a theme that recurs across deep time. Where opportunity exists, life reinvents gross morphology to exploit it. Bodies formerly adapted to land reconfigure for water. Limbs fuse into flippers, necks elongate or shorten. Sensory systems tuned to sonar light detection or to the pressure and light gradients of deep water. The Jurassic oceans were vibrant theatres of this morphological improvisation. Cretaceous, fain trying. With continental drift more advanced and climate shifting, the Cretaceous period became a new crucible of co-evolutionary intensity. A revolution in plant life. The rise and radiation of angiosperms flowering plants rewired terrestrial ecosystems. Where once conifers and cycads dominated, flowers introduced novelty, efficient reproductive strategies, rewards for pollinators, rapid diversification, and new habitats. This botanical upheaval rippled through the animal world. Insects diversified in step with flowers, honing mouthparts, flight patterns, and behaviors to exploit nectar and pollen. Birds and small theropods found opportunities for frugivory and seed dispersal. Herbivorous dinosaurs adapted their jaws and teeth to new diets. It is in the Cretaceous that the iconic forms etched in popular imagination fully take shape. Tyrannosaurus rex. T-Rex stands at the apex, a gigantic, powerfully built theropod with a massive skull, bone-crushing dentition, and forward-facing eyes that hint at depth perception. Whether T-Rex hunted live prey, scavenged, or combined both strategies has been the subject of decades of vigorous debate. The fossil evidence is nuanced, healed bite marks on contemporaneous bones, and where patterns on teeth suggest at least occasional predation and complex social interactions, not simple scavenging. In any case, T-Rex was an engine of destruction whose evolutionary lineage had honed jaws and a sensory toolkit into a formidable suite. Opposite this predatory shadow stood horned ceratopsians like Triceratops, Tricera in shorthand, armored with robust frills and formidable horns. Triceratops's head was a functional and expressive structure, defensive armature against large predators, possible sexual display, and perhaps a tool for intraspecific ritual. Herding behavior is suggested by bone beds and trackways. Such social systems confer protection for young and rearrange predator-prey dynamics across landscapes. Hadrosaurs, with intricate dental batteries, became the grazers of the age-efficient processors of plant material, able to exploit the new diversity of Cretaceous vegetation. A critical, subtle theme of this period is the increasing complexity of life history strategies and social behaviors. Nesting colonies, brooding postures inferred from fossilized eggs, evidence of parental care in some theropods. These lines of evidence suggest that dinosaurs were not merely instinct-bound machines, but organisms with sophisticated life cycles. Feathers proliferated in many theropod groups, not only in forms that would become birds, but also in larger lineages, where plumage could serve display or thermoregulation. Coloration, too, appears. Melanosome analyses hint at patterns born for display, camouflage, or species recognition. The sensation one gets from the Cretaceous fossil record is of vibrant visual and behavioral ecology. Displays traded information, colors signaled status, nests became arenas of investment. The skies and seas kept their own dramas. Pterosaurs reached gargantuan sizes in some clades, wing structures, musculature, and lightweight skeletons enabling them to rival terrestrial giants in spectacle. In the oceans, mosasaurs rose as dominant predators, their elongate bodies and powerful tails converting marine basins into hunting grounds. Ammonites, coiled and chambered, persisted as emblematic marine invertebrates, their spirals distributed through sedimentary records worldwide until the very end of the period. Yet there is an emotional chord underlying these panoramas, an urgent beauty tinged with fragility. The Cretaceous ecosystems were the product of long, cumulative elaboration. Intricate trophic links, co-evolved plant-pollinator interactions, and social systems woven through generations. Such complexity confers both resilience and vulnerability. Highly specialized mutualisms can flourish for millions of years, but when external shocks exceed the buffering capacity of ecosystems, those same specializations can become liabilities. From the vantage of deep time, the age of dinosaurs reads like a prolonged experiment in sustained adaptation. The narrative thread that runs across Triassic modesty, Jurassic majesty, and Cretaceous refinement is one of escalation paired with contingency. Morphologies are honed for current climates and food webs, behaviors evolve to exploit consistent seasonality, and yet these investments are always made in a world subject to planetary-scale perturbations. Volcanism, sea level swings, solar input variation, and, on rarer intervals, catastrophic impacts. There is also a quieter, philosophical insight. The dinosaurian world teaches that dominance is not the same as inevitability. For tens of millions of years, dinosaurs diversified into niches that, in many ways, left them extraordinarily well adapted to their environments. They evolved social complexity, parental investment, and sensory sophistication. They explored wings and feathers in parallel with giant bodies. But evolution is not a ladder with apexes, it is a branching, pruning process. The forms that seemed most successful in one context were not guaranteed survival in another, an idea that humbles any teleology of progress. As the Cretaceous draws toward its close, the stage feels taut. The world's choreography is complex, and the players are outstanding in their adaptations, yet there is a quiet sense of pending transformation that suffuses the fossil record. Floral turnovers, tectonic shifts, and climatic variations that subtly alter the balance of ecosystems. The age of dinosaurs is therefore both testament and question. Testament to the extraordinary capacities of life to diversify and inhabit every feasible niche. and a question about the durability of those capacities in the face of Earth's continuing volatility. In the end, the narrative of these 106 million years, Triassic smallness and persistence, Jurassic escalation into Titanic forms, and Cretaceous intricacy with icons like T-Rex and Tricera, reads as a study in evolutionary patience and planetary interplay. Scale changes, morphologies iterate, and complex ecologies assemble, yet all of it is written on a planet that forgets nothing, and again compels life to prove its adaptability. The age of dinosaurs, for all its drama, is part of that longer pattern, a long, patient experiment in how life reshapes and is reshaped by a world that never settles for stasis. What does it mean for a planet to be interrupted? Not by seasons or slow tectonics, but by a single, blunt punctuation that forces a world to stop mid-breath and reckon with a new set of rules. That is the image at the heart of the end of the Cretaceous, an epochal shock that redefined the possibilities of life on Earth. The Chicxulub impact, 66 million years ago. It was not merely an extinction. It was a planetary reconfiguration, a wholesale rewriting of climate, chemistry, and the ecological ledger. In an instant measured in minutes and hours, a 10-kilometer-wide projectile struck the Yucatan Peninsula with energy comparable to billions of atomic bombs. The collision did not arrive politely. The rock and dirt at the point of contact vaporized into a searing plasma, launching a fireball visible across continents. A condensation of superheated gas and molten rock rose, expanded, and rained molten droplets, glass spherules that would later be found as a thin but ubiquitous layer of beads in sediments around the globe, the geological fingerprint of that incandescent hour. The local crust collapsed, excavating an immense crater. From the rim, seismic waves radiated like the planet's bones being jarred. Earthquakes and aftershocks rippled across the globe, reshaping coastlines and triggering tsunamis of astonishing amplitude. The impact produced several immediate phenomena that read like a catalogue of planetary trauma. A heat pulse swept outward, an initial blast that momentarily ignited vegetation and drove an intense, instantaneous sterilization near the point of contact. Within hours, dust, ash, and a global veil of soot formed. Not just the coarse ejecta thrown into near space, but the combustion products of forests and peatlands set aflame around the world. This is the first act of the catastrophe, a bright, violent clearing of the visible sky, followed by a darkness that would endure far longer than any human night. It is important to think about the atmosphere as an actor in this drama. When carbonates and sulfur-bearing rocks at the impact site were vaporized, they released massive quantities of sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere. Soot from fires and aerosols of sulfur and dust combined to produce an optical blanket that blocked sunlight, possibly for months to years. Photosynthesis, the engine of nearly all complex food webs, was throttled. Surface temperatures plunged as incoming solar radiation failed to reach the ground. The planet entered a period that scientists liken to a prolonged, catastrophic winter, often called an impact winter. Plants stopped growing at scale. Phytoplankton, the photosynthetic foundation of marine food webs, declined drastically where light penetration fell. The global economy of energy that had supported forests, grasslands, and complex marine communities lost its daily top-up. There were other chemical insidiousnesses. Acid rain, choked with nitric and sulfuric compounds formed in the post-impact atmosphere, fell across continents and oceans, stripping soils and poisoning freshwater refuges. The oceans, for their part, experienced a complex sequence, initial shock waves and heat pulses, followed by a dramatic decrease in surface productivity as algal blooms failed. Without photosynthetically produced oxygen and organic export, the upper ocean chemistry shifted. Deeper waters, stagnant and cut off from oxygen replenishment, turned anoxic. In these oxygen-starved shells, hydrogen sulfide could accumulate, a toxic brew for most marine metazoans. The combined effect was an ecological suffocation on a global scale. Imagine the seas in that moment of unraveling. Coastal ecologies were battered by the initial tsunamis, which swept up sediment, uprooted productive shallow habitats, and mixed waters in violent churns. In the immediate aftermath, when skies were still bright from the initial fireball in some places, surface waters may have been briefly sterilized near the impact region by heat. Later, as the world dimmed, the phytoplankton that sustained zooplankton and small fishes dwindled, causing cascading collapses up the food chain. Top predators that relied on abundant shoals suddenly faced scarcity. Among those top predators were the great marine reptiles and formidable sharks of the Cretaceous seas. Mosasaurus. Enormous, streamlined marine lizards that patrolled shallow continental shelves and open waters with powerful tails and tooth-lined jaws, had evolved to exploit abundant fish, squid-like cephalopods, and even smaller marine reptiles. Ancient sharks of the time, cousins of modern predatory lineages, filled niches from coastal ambushers to open water hunters. These predators had been honed to a world of productive, stratified seas where seasonal and regional upwellings guaranteed prey. When the base of that food web collapsed, their agile hunting and size offered no immunity. Without a steady supply of prey, hunting efficiency declines into desperation. Carcasses become rarer. The metabolic costs of maintaining large bodies become a death sentence in a world of meager returns. But the collapse was not instantaneous or uniform. Some pockets, freshwater lakes, subterranean caves, deep-sea refugia, and isolated wetlands offered temporary havens where light and nutrients were sufficient for survival. The survivors were often organisms with generalist diets, those that could live off detritus, and species whose life cycles were short and fecund. Microbial blooms, opportunistic bacteria capable of exploiting low oxygen conditions, proliferated. The fabric of ecosystems changed from a tapestry woven by specialists to a coarse patchwork stitched by tolerant generalists. The geological record preserves the traces of this global convulsion in distinctive signatures. A worldwide thin clay layer enriched in iridium, a metal more common in asteroids than in earthly crust, marks the KPG boundary. Spherules of glass, shocked quartz with its microscopic deformation, and abrupt shifts in fossil assemblages confirm the suddenness and severity of turnover. In sediments, the last abundant dinosaur bones are often overlain by this ejecta layer, a mute testament to the immediacy of erasure. Yet extinction is not only removal, it is also the clearing of ecological space. The Chicxulub event, combined with already ongoing environmental stresses such as volcanic episodes and sea level changes, acted as a sieve. It eliminated dominant forms, the non-avian dinosaurs being the most conspicuous among them. But it also reshaped evolutionary trajectories. The loss of ecological incumbents opened niches that favored different strategies. Small body size, generalist and opportunistic diets, nocturnality, burrowing, and other modes of persistence. Mammaliforms, small, often furry, likely nocturnal creatures that had existed in the shadows of the Mesozoic, found ecological vacancies in the wake of the catastrophe. Birds, the avian descendants of certain theropods, persisted in multiple lineages, their small size, flight, or generalized feeding allowing survival in fragmented landscapes. Reptilian and amphibian lineages that could endure aquatic or semi-aquatic conditions also fared better. The post-impact world unfolded in phases. First, the darkness and cold of the impact, winter suppressed primary production. Over decades to centuries, as aerosols settled and sunlight gradually returned, a partial recovery began. But the story did not simply return to the pre-impact status quo. Carbon dioxide released from vaporized carbonates and from wildfires increased greenhouse forcing over longer timescales, meaning that after an imposed cold, the planet warmed. This oscillation from an initial plunge to a long-term warming added further stress on ecosystems struggling to re-establish themselves. Ocean acidification inhibited the calcifying organisms. Plankton with calcareous shells, mollusks, some corals, reducing another pillar of marine food webs. Recovery of complex ecosystems was a protracted, uneven process that took hundreds of thousands to millions of years for full compositional and structural restoration in many regions. There is a paradox in this planetary upheaval. Extinction was both catastrophic and creative. The short-term effect was a radical pruning. The long-term effect was a wholesale reallocation of ecological opportunity. The survivors were not necessarily the fittest in a static sense. They were those whose life histories happened to be compatible with sudden, severe disruption. Small size, fast reproduction, flexible diets, burrowing, and semi-aquatic lifestyles became, for the moment, favored traits. Over deep time, these traits facilitated diversification. Mammals, birds, and many modern groups trace their broader ecological occupations to that post-impact opportunity space. The age of dinosaurs ceded to an age shaped by new actors, though the old lineages left indelible legacies in anatomy, behavior, and even in the genes of survivors. Beyond the biological, the extinction leaves an intellectual and emotional impression. It is a lesson in contingency, a large celestial body on a collision course, a particular target geology that amplified atmospheric release of volatiles, a set of ecosystems structured in ways susceptible to collapse. Together, these contingencies produced a dramatic outcome. The KPG event also teaches about the fragility and robustness of planetary systems. Fragile in the face of a sudden perturbation, robust in their capacity for reassembly and renewal over geological time. The Earth remembers the event in its rocks, in the iridium layer, in shocked minerals, in sudden faunal turnovers, yet life, persistently inventive, writes new chapters from the blanked pages. If one seeks a human resonance in these transformations, it lies not in a moralizing story, but in a sober humility. The long-term arc of life is not a steady march of progress. It is a sequence of experiments punctuated by accidents. What flourishes in one context may be wiped out by a contingency entirely independent of its success. From the perspective of deep time, the end. Cretaceous extinction is neither tragedy nor triumph alone. It is a pivot, an example of how planetary scale events can recalibrate the evolutionary roulette. And so the age that ended with a fireball also began new possibilities. Mosasaurus and its shark contemporaries, magnificent in their moment, became footnotes in a geological turnover that favored different anatomies and ecologies. The iridium layer and glass spherules remain as a global badge of sudden change. They allow modern eyes to reconstruct an abrupt punctuation in the long narrative. The world that followed was, in many respects, unfamiliar, shaped by survivors that had learned, in various ways, to be adaptable to extremes. Over millions of years, they would craft forests, rivers, and oceans anew, and eventually produce lineages capable of asking the question that opens this chapter. What does it mean for a planet to be interrupted? Across deep time, that interruption has a double character. It is a moment of destructive decimation and a beginning of new evolutionary experimentation. The Chicxulub impact sits at that hinge, a reminder that Earth's story is written by both steady processes and by punctuation marks, so violent they reset the terms of life's possibilities. In the quieter epochs after the upheaval, life's patient combinatorics, variation, selection, contingency, would again compose ecosystems of astonishing complexity. But the memory of that decisive day is never truly erased. It persists in the thin, global seam of spherules and iridium and in the shape of evolutionary lineages that rose from the ash and the dark. What does it mean for a world to hand the empty stage to the small and the unnoticed? When the thunder of giants subsides and the great incumbents vanish beneath a layer of ash and glass, the question that follows is not one of spectacle, but of opportunity. Who will crawl into the niches left cold and reconfigure them into webs of life? The answer, in the 66 million years after the impact at Chicxulub, is a slow, patient story of subtlety. It is the story of mammals, diminutive at first, overlooked, resilient, transforming a vacated theatre into a crowded, complicated world. The immediate aftermath of the extinction was a time of filtering. The great, specialized forms that had dominated Mesozoic ecosystems collapsed. What remained were lineages whose lives were written in flexibility. Small body size, generalist diets, burrowing habits, nocturnal habits, litters that could rebound quickly. Mammalia forms and their kin, previously marginalized in the shadow of dinosaurs, found that their traits, fur for insulation, endothermy that buffered temperature swings, lactation that decoupled neonatal survival from erratic food supplies, were suddenly extraordinary assets. They did not explode into prominence like fireworks. They crept, diversified, and tested ecological permutations across a planet still reeling from perturbation. The earliest chapters after the boundary are modest in scale, but bold in implication. In Paleocene forests and swamp margins, mammaliforms radiated into a bewildering array of forms. Some became small insectivores and omnivores, their anatomy tuned to quick turns and scavenging. Others thickened into larger herbivores, the pantodonts and primitive ungulate-like condylarths, creatures that began to assume the ecological roles once held by multi-toned dinosaurs. Carnivorous mammals, creodonts and early carnivoramorphs, crafted new predator-prey dynamics not by brute force but by stealth, endurance and dental specialization. The global script rewrote itself species by species. Molars shifted from shearing blades to grinding plates. Limbs rotated from sprawling paddles to more erect, energy-efficient stances. Skulls refined sensory arenas for smell, sound, and touch. That refinement had a tempo that matched planetary rhythms. The Paleocene was a warm, verdant time. Forests extended poleward, and corridors of foliage allowed tropical-adapted mammals to disperse widely. Then, in the early Eocene, a brief, furious episode altered the pace. The Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum, PETM, a geologically quick spike in temperature and carbon, pressed ecosystems into extreme adjustment. For some lineages, the PET was a crisis. For others, it was an opportunity. Migrations swept across continents like tidal waves of small bodies. Faunal turnover replaced some archaic groups with more derived forms that could exploit changed resources. Body sizes shifted, sometimes shrinking in response to heat or limited resources. In other instances, warming permitted the expansion of ecological ranges. These shocks were not mere side notes. They were evolutionary accelerators, testing traits and rewarding versatility. Over the next tens of millions of years, a pattern emerged, repeated radiations and refinements. Bats, the only mammals to perfect powered flight, appeared in the early Eocene. a flurry of aerial innovation that opened feeding strategies among the night and dawn. Rodents diversified explosively, a story of gnawing teeth and reproductive fecundity that would make them ubiquitous engineers of seed dispersal and soil turnover. Primates branched into arboreal experiments, grasping hands and forward-looking eyes appearing in small, cautious forms that navigated canopy geometry. Each major clade carried within it a suite of pre-adaptations, physiological, anatomical, and behavioral, that, under changing climates and landscapes, could be recombined into new ecological solutions. Two lines especially illustrate how mammalian experimentation translated into striking morphologies. One is the lineage that would give rise to horses, the other leads, more distantly and enigmatically, to elephants. Neither path was a straight march toward the iconic shapes known to modern eyes. Both were long, contingent, and bound to the rhythms of climate and vegetation. In the Eocene, the ancestors of horses were small, dog-sized creatures, often grouped under names like Hyracotherium or Eohippus that lived in forested environments. Their limbs bore multiple toes adapted for maneuvering across leaf-littered substrates rather than for sustained high-speed running. Their teeth were low-crowned, suited to softer foliage and fruits. But as the planet cooled and woodlands thinned, especially across the Oligocene into the Miocene, open grassy habitats expanded. Grasses are chemically and physically different from leaves, more abrasive, often containing silica, and found in dense low mats that favor distance over nimble maneuvering. In response, a sequence of subtle, iterative transformations accumulated. Teeth became higher crowned and more complex, resistant to wear. Toes were reduced and compressed into fewer, more robust weight-bearing digits, limb kinematics lengthened, digestive strategies adjusted for fibrous diets. Over millions of years, the lineage traversed a morphological gradient from a small browsing forest dweller to the long-limbed, single-toed grazers that would trot across late Cenozoic plains. The horse's arc is a microcosm of mammalian adaptability. Small morphological shifts, repeated and compounded, yield dramatic functional transitions under the pressure of environmental change. The proboscidean story, the origin of elephants and their kin, is another tale of protracted invention. Their early relatives were not giants, but modest-bodied, Afrotherian mammals evolving in Paleocene, Eocene landscapes that would, in places, be humid and warm. The emergence of an elongated trunk and tusks was not a single leap, but a series of incremental changes in craniofacial architecture, musculature, and behavior. Early proboscideans, such as Moeritherium, were semi-aquatic and hippo-like in proportions, using low crania and flexible lips to forage in marshes. As habitats evolved toward drier mosaics in later epochs, selective pressures favored larger body size for thermoregulatory stability, extended reach for browsing, and tusks for both feeding and social displays. By the Miocene, multiple lineages of proboscideans had radiated globally, experimenting with body plans, short-tusked, shovel-toothed forms, the gigantic, pillar-limbed Deinothers, and the ancestors that would culminate in modern elephants. The trunk's appearance, a versatile organ for manipulating food, water, and social signals, embodies a recurring theme in mammalian evolution. Structures that begin as modest functional tweaks can, under persistent selection, become radically innovative tools. These transformations did not occur in isolation. The Cenozoic, the age often dubbed the Age of Mammals, is better understood as a long negotiation between climate, plants, and mammalian strategies. As global temperatures cooled and ice sheets waxed and waned, habitats oscillated between forests, woodlands, and open grasslands. The expansion of grasses in the Miocene was tectonically and climatically mediated. Changes in seasonality, atmospheric CO2, and the uplift of mountain ranges that altered precipitation patterns. For mammals, these vegetal revolutions rewired food webs. Herbivores evolved hypsodont teeth for abrasive diets, digestive systems diversified from simple guts to more complex foregut and hindgut fermenters, social behaviors adapted to migration and herd safety. Predators responded. Cursorial carnivores emerged with limb proportions and sensory acuity tuned to chase or ambush in more open terrain. In that push and pull, ecosystems refined themselves into the mosaic landscapes that would dominate much of the Neogene. Equally significant was the expansion of subterranean and fossorial lifestyles. Burrowing mammals, rodents, early insectivores, and specialized clades exploited a refuge strategy. The underground is buffer against extremes, more stable thermally, shielded from surface cataclysms, and abundant in invertebrate prey or roots. These behaviors contributed to ecological stability and paved pathways for later innovations. The habit of building nests, caching food, and tending young under cover increased juvenile survival and allowed life histories to lengthen and diversify. One must also register the role of continents and geographic ties. Plate tectonics continued to reconfigure connections among landmasses, enabling dispersal, vicariance, and regional radiations. North America, Eurasia, Africa, and South America each played unique roles. Faunal exchanges, such as the Great American Biotic Interchange much later, were made possible only when land corridors emerged or vanished. Mammals were the planet's prime navigators of such changing geographies, with clades radiating in situ and others migrating to exploit open ecological space. Throughout these chapters, a recurring surprise is how often small, seemingly marginal innovations seeded large outcomes. Fur, lactation, and nocturnality, traits that once buffered mammals against Mesozoic dominance, remained crucial as conditions changed. The evolution of more complex sociality and parental care created developmental strategies that rewarded longer juvenile periods and learning. Brains enlarged in some lineages, not inevitably, but where ecological complexity and sociality selected for problem-solving capacities. In the deep record, this unfolded as an uneven mosaic. Certain lineages scaled up cognitive and sensory systems markedly, primates, cetaceans, some carnivorans, while others remained exquisitely specialized for narrow niches. The oceanic realm, too, recorded mammalian reinvention. Cetaceans, whales and dolphins trace a dramatic evolutionary trajectory from terrestrial, even-hoofed ancestors into fully aquatic giants. The earliest archaeocetes of the Eocene reveal limb structures still capable of supporting weight on land, but increasingly modified for swimming. Over millions of years, limbs became paddles, nostrils migrated dorsally toward blowholes, and body shapes elongated into torpedoes adapted for gliding through water. Whales' evolution underscores a paradox. Returning to the sea required a re-engineering of mammalian identity even as it exploited pre-existing mammalian traits. Thick blubber for insulation, sophisticated lungs for breath control, and social complexity for cooperative feeding. By the time the Neogene ground toward the present, mammalian communities were complex, regionally distinct, and richly partitioned. Elephants trumpeted across savannas and woodlands, horses galloped in herds across sweeping plains, rodents gnawed and tunneled, bats filled nocturnal skies, primates explored arboreal niches, and later, in narrow locales, the beginnings of bipedal experiments in hominin ancestors. Each clade story threaded into ecosystems through interactions, predation, competition, mutualism, and parasitism. That stabilized some arrangements and made others precarious. A philosophical pause is warranted. The rise of mammals was neither inevitable nor teleological. The extinction that created the initial opening was a contingency. The rise of particular mammal groups depended on further contingencies. Climate shifts, plant innovations, like the spread of grasses, continental rearrangements, and stochastic radiations. The narrative that emerges in the rocks is one of repeated contingency followed by cumulative adaptation. The small survivors were not fated to dominate. They were simply the organisms whose pre-existing traits matched a novel landscape's selective demands. From that match, however, cascades of morphological and ecological innovation followed, producing bodies and behaviors of such diversity and ingenuity that the planet's later chapters would be sculpted in their image. If there is an emotional register to this epoch, it is one of quiet persistence amplified into consequence. The mammalian story is not melodrama, it is endurance. It is the patient rearrangement of molars, the incremental reduction of toes, the slow build-up of tusk and trunk, the stealthy ascent into flight, and the reclamation of oceans. It is the gathering of small experiments into a robust tapestry, stitched across tens of millions of years. It is, finally, the reassertion that in deep time, prominence can arise not from single grand gestures, but from the repetition of small, pliant, and often humble strategies. As the Cenozoic heads toward the later epochs, the stage is crowded and complex. Mammals have occupied the niches vacated by extinct titans and have invented entirely new ones. They have become architects of landscape through grazing, rooting, and migration. They have driven evolutionary responses in plants and in one another. The rise of mammals is thus a story of scaling, from microhabitats to global biomes, and of invention without foresight. What began as a whisper after catastrophe becomes, over geological patience, a chorus of forms. The primitive elephants lumbering into wetlands and woodlands, the long-limbed ancestors of horses picking at early grasses, the nocturnal dens and burrows that buffered families against capricious climates. The planet remembered the extinction and then, in its recombinant generosity, permitted a different cast of actors to claim prominence. In that claim, the Earth's narrative changed, patiently and profoundly, as smallness became a lever for something new and vast. What does it signify when a world invents hands? It is a question of leverage and intimacy. Not the leverage of machines, but the kind that comes from small, curved fingers closing on a twig, a fruit, a sibling. In the long sweep between 55 and 7 million years ago, Earth supplied the theatre and physics. Forests with soft substrates, branches that swayed and broke, fruits that ripened in unpredictable patterns, and a climate that would, over epochs, press and pry at those living upon it. Into that mutable stage came a suite of creatures that would change the way bodies touched the world. The first true primates and, in parallel, the heavy, slow actors of the understory and plains. Early rhinoceroses and their kin, creatures whose sizes and habits rewove landscapes and ecological possibilities. In the immediate aftermath of the dinosaur exit, the planet ran hot. The early Eocene was a time of botanical exuberance and geographic connectivity. Forests carpeted much of the northern continents, and warm, wet corridors linked habitats across what would later be oceans and deserts. It is here, in the dappled dim of ancient canopies and in the tangle of lianas, that the first euprimates emerged, small-bodied, wide-eyed animals whose anatomies hinted at a new dossier of skills. They arrived with a characteristic toolkit, grasping hands and feet with nails instead of claws, tactile pads dense with nerve endings, limbs that could rotate, and forward-facing eyes permitting overlapping visual fields for depth perception. These were not random embellishments. They were solutions to particular problems. Navigating three-dimensional, unstable surfaces, plucking small, nutritious fruits and insects, judging distances when leaping between branches, holding onto a parent as the world pitched beneath them. The fossil record, in the form of fragmentary jaws and wrist bones in delicate orbital architecture, records these morphological experiments across Eurasia, North America, and Africa. Omomyids and adapiforms in the Eocene, their lineages splintering and radiating in response to local ecologies. To imagine this world is to feel a constant, low suspense. The canopy was not a sanctuary of peace, but an arena of calculation and risk. A juvenile clinging to a mother's fur felt the sway of branches as a persistent hazard, not unlike the small, sharp disturbances that shaped evolutionary pathways elsewhere. Every successful reach, every fruit captured without falling, translated into more copies of genes that favored the same hand-eye coordination and cautious daring. Over millions of years, selection amplified these capacities. Grasping became more precise, vision more acute, social bonds more complex. Parallel to the story of small arboreal innovators unfolded another narrative on the forest floor and in more open habitats. The rise of perissodactyls, the odd-toed ungulates. Among them were the ancestors of horses, tapirs, and rhinoceroses. Early perissodactyls were not the ponderous giants later imagination might conjure. Many were modest, deer-sized browsers negotiating dense underbrush. But across the Oligocene and into the Miocene, some branches of this group took different evolutionary routes. Escalating body mass, changes in feeding strategies, and adaptations to drier, more open environments produced increasingly conspicuous herbivores. Rhinocerotoids provide a vivid example. From relatively small, hornless ancestors, they diversified into a range of forms, tank-like browsers that reshaped understory vegetation, cursorial species that raced across plains, and, in a striking episode of gigantism, Paraceratherium, a colossal, hornless rhinocerotide that towered above most contemporary browsers in the Oligocene and early Miocene. The presence of such large herbivores mattered in ways beyond spectacle. They altered plant community structure, pruned forests, created clearings, and redistributed nutrients through their dung and trampling. In doing so, they influenced the very niches available to smaller mammals, including primates. The ecological interplay was not directed or intentional. It was an emergent property of bodies interacting with plants under the constraints of climate and geology. Those constraints themselves were altering. The thermal hump of the Eocene eventually gave way to a long-term cooling trend. Around 34 million years ago, the planet's climate shifted decisively with the onset of Antarctic glaciation. Forests retreated in some regions, replaced by more open woodlands and savanna-like mosaics in others. The Miocene, whose middle warmth briefly returned greater diversity and range extension for apes and their kin, ultimately marched toward increasing seasonal contrast and aridity in many places. These climatic oscillations produced geographic fragmentation. Corridors became barriers, continuous canopies fractioned into islands of trees, and forced animals to adapt to new regimes. Primate evolution responded in predictable and idiosyncratic ways. In Africa, the Miocene saw a splendid radiation of apes, proconsul in East African rift valleys, dryopithecids in Europe, and multiple lineages in Asia, such as Civipithecus. Some of these forms were arboreal specialists, other more generalized. The anatomy of many Miocene apes reveals bodies capable of both suspensory locomotion and climbing, skulls that began to experiment with the facial shapes that would much later be refashioned in ape and human lineages. Yet the fossil tapestry is patchy and full of open questions. The ape radiation was not a neat, linear prelude to hominins. It was a branching, experimental episode in which different strategies, varied teeth, locomotor repertoires, and dietary niches were tested against shifting environments. Dietary opportunity steered much of this exploration. Fruit availability, leaf quality, and insect abundance are variables that change with climate and plant community. Enclosed, fruit-rich canopies, the primate package of grasping hands and forward vision was especially victorious. In more open or seasonal habitats, other adaptations mattered. Be ready to move on the ground, tolerate broader diets, or shift activity patterns to meet cooler nights or resource scarcity. Over time, some primate lineages trended toward more terrestriality, a gradual negotiation of selection pressures where hands began to be used for manipulation as often as for locomotion. There is a social dimension too, an emergent property of primate life that moves beyond anatomy. Extended juvenile periods, the need for complex foraging strategies, and the benefits of cooperative defense or resource sharing favored greater social cognition. Bonds formed and were maintained through grooming, vocalizations, and the careful choreography of social hierarchy. Brains enlarged, not qualitatively in a single instant, but subtly, generation by generation, as selection rewarded the behavioral flexibility that social living required. These cognitive investments paid dividends when environments changed, populations capable of adjusting foraging patterns, learning new food sources, or exploiting microhabitats fared better than rigid specialists. As the Miocene faded, the late Neogene world tightened further. The development of global seasonality and the progressive cooling of high latitudes brought increased climatic variability, while the classical Pleistocene glacial cycles, the rhythm of ice ages and warm interludes familiar to recent human history, dominate popular understandings of late Quaternary climate. The late Neogene already displayed oscillations between cooler, dry intervals and warmer, wetter ones that reshaped habitats dramatically. In Africa, the expansion of grasslands and the fragmentation of forests are key backdrop processes. The evolutionary consequence is palpable. Hominoids with terrestrial proclivities and different dietary strategies began to occupy niches at the forest margin. It is in this setting that the last common ancestor of the lineages that would become modern humans and modern chimpanzees must be sought. By roughly 7 to 6 million years ago, a new chapter was opening in the complex mosaic of African habitats, patches of woodland interleaved with more open ground, climatic variability, producing both resource bottlenecks and novel opportunities. The skeletal hints we possess from late Miocene hominins, fragmentary teeth, partial jaws, a handful of postcranial bones, suggest creatures negotiating a life both arboreal and terrestrial, bodies shaped by the tight balance of tree climbing and ground locomotion, diets flexible enough to span fruits, tubers, and perhaps scavenged or hunted animal matter. They were not upright walkers in the modern sense of human bipedality, but they were part of a lineage in which locomotor and dietary experimentation would accumulate into new anatomical configurations. Alongside this hominin emergence, the world still hosted the heavy, influential presence of rhinoceratoids and other megaherbivores. Their ecological roles remained consequential. Browsing pressure maintained mosaic habitats, dung-nourished soils, and trampling created trails and waterholes that other animals exploited. The interplay between small-bodied primates and large-bodied herbivores is an understated theme in the deep narrative. Large mammals reconfigured landscapes in ways that influenced the selective context for smaller species. A clearing once grazed open could become a stage for hominin foraging strategies. More visual predation, more tool use potential, different predator avoidance tactics. The planet's actors co-authored one another's evolutionary pressures simply by being what they were. There is a particular kind of poignancy to this interval. The prime innovations of primates, touch, vision, manipulative limbs, social intelligence, are quiet in the fossil record. They are preserved as minute changes in joint shapes or tooth wear patterns. The large-bodied forms, rhinos, ungulates, leave massive, unmistakable prints. The narrative tension arises from the realization that both scales of actors are mutually consequential. The small adaptations that allowed fingers to flex and eyes to focus became, across epochs, competencies that could be repurposed for tool use, for complex social transmission, for the cultural buffering of environmental change. The large-bodied actors, through their ecological engineering, carved and maintained the stage upon which those small innovations played out. What binds these stories, hands and hooves, graspers and grazers, is the subtle choreography of contingency. Climate oscillated between warm epochs and cooler intervals. Forests expanded and contracted, continents shifted, opening and closing dispersal routes. Evolution did not march toward a preordained goal. It wandered through a landscape of possibilities, testing anatomical configurations against shifting environments. Primates, by emphasizing manipulation and sociality, accumulated a toolkit rich in behavioral plasticity. Large herbivores, by shaping plant communities physically and chemically, altered the distribution of resources. In the decades of deep time that followed, these threads would tangle and retangle, sometimes fraying under catastrophe, sometimes reinforcing into new tapestries of form and function. The emotional tenor of this chapter is not triumphalism, but patient creativity. There is awe in watching, through fossil fragments and isotope signatures, the emergence of traits that would eventually make possible the capacity to fashion tools, form complex social groups, and reflect upon origins. Yet there is also humility. These innovations were small steps in vast, indifferent millennia. The world that taught hands to grasp did so without intention. It shuffled anatomical possibilities and left the winners to persist. And as the climate continued to swing between colder and warmer phases toward the end of this interval, the stage was set for more radical shifts to come, for bipedal experiments, for tool use to intensify, and for a lineage that had once been one of many arboreal mammals to move, in its own way, into a different ecological choreography. In the long ledger of Earth's history, the first primates are a modest but pivotal entry. The first sustained recoding of movement and perception that favored manual dexterity and social cognition. Rhinoceroses and their kin, massive and consequential, were the landscape makers whose bulk defined habitats and resources. Between their scales, and within the oscillations of climate, a new set of possibilities emerged. Hands, eyes, and social minds were not inevitable. They were one of many outcomes of a mutable world. Yet once the competence of grasping was in place, the future could be, and would be, recomposed in ways that no single fossil could predict. 11. Early hominins, 7 to 2 million years before. What does it feel like to stand upright for the first time and, in so doing, to change the terms of being on a wet, sunlit continent? That image. An animal learning to balance its weight upon 2 feet to free its hands for other work serves as a hinge in the long story of life. It is not a single invention, but a reconfiguration of bodies, behaviors, and possibilities. The era in which Australopiths learned to walk the thin line between earth and tree. Across a span of millions of years, in a world still patterned by the rhythms of forests and savannas, populations of hominins emerged who carried a paradox in their anatomy. Their hips, pelvis, and lower limbs recorded a commitment to bipedal locomotion. The pelvis shortened, the foramen magnum shifted forward under the skull, the femur angled inward to bring weight under a central axis. Yet their forelimbs and hands retained the strength and curved fingers of climbers. It is as if the body had split a vocation in two, walking the long distances between trees while still mastering the vertical complexity of branches and cliffs. They were, in anatomical terms, both ground walkers and canopy dwellers. To imagine the mindscape of these hominins is to imagine a constant negotiation between two worlds. The cool, shadowed recesses of trees that offered refuge and food, and the wide, exposed plains where visibility brought both food and risk. In that negotiation, emotion and cognition were present not as elaborate cultural states, but as evolved tendencies. Careful curiosity, wary attention, a social attentiveness that favoured lookouts and shared alarm. Mothers held infants close, with arms adapted to both cling and carry. Toddlers learned a dual repertoire of grasp and step. Mobility became a social currency. Those who could ferry food quickly from perching sites to a waiting group accumulated favour. Those who could stand upright to scan the horizon for cats and snakes conferred safety. Stone tools enter this scene like a new register in an ongoing chorus. Simple flakes and core tools, edged stones struck from larger pebbles, appear in the archaeological record, and with them an unmistakable change in behaviour. The earliest tools were not elegant, they were functional. A sharp flake could shear meat from a carcass, a rounded hammerstone could crack bones for marrow, and a prepared core could be carried and reused. These were not the polished artifacts of later times, but they amplified capabilities. A hominin with a sharp flake could turn a scavenged limb into a resource, and the community that learned to recognize and share the utility of such objects gained an edge. Organization begins to appear in the traces of these groups. The patterns of butchery on bones, the clustering of tools near safe water and sheltered spots suggest communicated knowledge and repeated practice. The learned sequence of striking a core, detaching a flake, scraping meat, and saving the nutritional prize of marrow. Communication at this stage was not language in the modern sense, but it was coordinated behaviour grounded in attention, imitation, and perhaps rudimentary vocal signals and gestures. A gesture could direct the gaze, a shared call could designate safety or warning. These were small scaffolds upon which social learning could hang. Emotion in such lives would have been direct and functional. The short-term urgency of fear at the approach of a large cat, at the rumble of a storm, would sharpen cognition and bind groups together. The quieter currents were equally important. The satisfaction of a meal shared, the relief when an infant was returned to a mother's breast, the small, repetitive pleasures of manipulating stones and watching a sharp edge appear under skillful hands. Those pleasures are not anthropological flights of fancy. They can be inferred as adaptive, reward systems that reinforce learning, that encourage the passing of technique from older to younger, that bias attention toward objects and sequences that improve survival. Laetoli's footprints, pressed into wet ash and preserved for 3.6 million years, capture some of this world's ordinary choreography. Two-footed impressions march across time, a record of balance, stride, and gait. The prints are not the footprints of a single hero. They are the anonymous impressions of a small social band. They show a family or group moving together, perhaps between feeding sites. The rhythm of their steps, a reminder that walking upright changed how hominins inhabited distance and visibility. Upright posture freed hands and attention for new tasks, carrying food, carrying infants, carrying knowledge. Dietary strategies in this era were flexible and opportunistic. Hominins exploited fruit, tubers, nuts, and the protein rich in bones. Access to meat, whether scavenged from predator kills or, occasionally, secured through coordinated drives and short-distance pursuits, had nutritional consequences. Meat and marrow are dense in calories and micronutrients that support brain development. The energetic returns of these foods may have changed reproductive strategies, longer juvenile periods, more intensive parental investment, and the social structures required to provision young. There is a subtle but crucial shift in how value was stored and transmitted. Tools are externalized memory. A sharp flake encodes the skill of percussion. An accumulated set of cores and discarded flakes forms a site-specific library of technique. Children watching elders learned not only by trial and error, but by example. The repeated practice of stoneworking becomes a medium for cultural inheritance. A successful napping sequence is a grammar of action passed across generations, occasionally improved through variation and experimentation. In this domain, cognition and material culture begin a slow coevolution. New neural investments are favored when they yield improved tool use. Better tools, in turn, alter foraging efficiency and social organization. Yet these hominins remained embedded in a world where chance could still erase long stretches of accumulated knowledge. A drought could thin a group's numbers. A predator event could scatter a band. Persistence in such an environment required redundancy in social networks, flexibility in diet and movement, and a behavioral repertoire broad enough to adopt new practices when old ones failed. Across 7 to 2 million years, the arc of early hominins is neither a straight line toward humanity nor a march of inevitable progress. It is instead a patient, contingent refinement. Bodies adapting for bipedalism without forsaking the tree, hands learning precision while still remaining graspers. Communities coordinating enough to share the benefits of learned technique. These were not hominins with scripture and city plans. They were organisms who, through the slow accretion of small inventions and social habits, set the stage for what would come next. 12. Homo and the ascent of craft, fire, and migration. What does it mean for a lineage to discover not merely a tool, but the architecture of tools, plans that can be transmitted, refined, and scaled across landscapes? That is the quiet revolution of Homo, a genus that reshaped the relationship between body, object, and environment, and that carried its inventions outward across continents. At roughly 2 million years ago, fossils and stone assemblages show the emergence of forms that paleontologists designate as early Homo. Relative to their Australopith predecessors, these hominins show changes in cranial capacity, limb proportions, and dental morphology. Their faces flatten slightly, their teeth reduce in size and alter in shape, and crucially, their brains expand in ways that correlate with more complex behaviors. This is not immediate intelligence as the modern mind knows it. It is rather a greater capacity for manipulation, sequence memory, and social learning. Toolkits diversify and refine. The old Darwin tradition, simple cores and flakes, gives way, in many regions and over time, to more structured technologies. The Acheulean hand axe appears, a symmetrical biface whose production demands planning and a mental template. Making a hand axe is not merely striking. It is an anticipatory act, selecting a blank, visualizing a shape, methodically removing flakes to approach the intended form. This cognitive choreography implies more than motor skill. It implies foresight, teaching, and perhaps standards of aesthetic or functional judgment shared across groups. One of the most consequential technologies is fire. The control of burning transforms daily life. Fire provides warmth, light into the night, a means to cook and thus to pre-process food, and a focal point for social gathering. Heat alters calories, cooked starches and proteins become more digestible, reducing energetic costs of digestion and possibly contributing to further brain expansion. Nighttime fire widens the temporal envelope of sociality, conversation, teaching, The repair of tools, social rituals can unfold under embers. The archaeological record suggests controlled use of fire by H. erectus and related forms in multiple regions, a technology that reshapes behavior, physiology, and ecological impact. Emotional life, in the broad sense, deepens with these changes. The hearth becomes a social magnet. The glow of coals draws a group into proximity, fostering bonding and the exchange of information in ways daylight cannot. The feeling of shared warmth, of safety at night, of the social negotiation around distribution and defense of food. These are emergent social architectures. The investment in offspring lengthens, prolonged childhood becomes a space for learning complex skills, for socialization, for the cultural accumulation that is the hallmark of Homo. Migration is another thread. Long legs and more efficient bipedal locomotion make long-distance walking energetically viable. Combined with technological buffers, clothing, fire, toolkits, early Homo groups crossed ecological thresholds that Australopiths rarely did. Homo erectus, in particular, spreads out of Africa into Eurasia roughly 1.8 million years ago, carrying the Acheulean technology and a suite of adaptive behaviors. This expansion is not the conquest of homogeneous emptiness. It is a repeated negotiation with primates, with predators, with unfamiliar plant and animal communities. Each advance tests cognition and technology, new stone blanks to be found, different fuels to be burned, varied seasons to be coped with. Migration, in this view, is a chronic experiment in niche construction. Language, the slow unfolding of structured vocal and gestural communication, cannot be pinpointed precisely in fossils. Yet the social scaffolding extended childhoods, coordinated hunting and butchery, tool instruction at hearths, creates selection pressures favoring more efficient transmission of complex sequences. Vocal plasticity, paired with gestures and prosodic cues around fires, would have amplified the capacity for planning and cooperation. Even rudimentary symbolic acts, marking, mnemonic objects, patterned tool forms, hint at a growing cognitive substrate for shared meaning. Hunting strategies become more elaborate and cooperative. Where earlier hominins likely scavenged opportunistically, later Homo develops coordinated pursuit and ambush behaviors. The archaeological signatures, cut marks systematically positioned on bones, locations where stone tools cluster with butchered remains, suggest organized group activity. Drives, shared kills, perhaps communal butchery stations near water or safe shelters. Division of labor emerges in broad strokes. Those who range farther to find large prey, those who process meat at the hearth, those who transport resources to nursing mothers and juveniles. This is not modern industry, but a nascent economy of shared labor and reciprocal provisioning. Material culture expands beyond stones. Organic materials, wood, hide, cordage, leave faint traces but would have been abundant in daily life. Clothing and shelters, whether temporary lean-tos or more sustained structures, extend the range of habitability. Hafting, tying stone points to wooden shafts, improves hunting efficiency. The cumulative consequence is an increasingly mediated relationship with the environment. Homo no longer only adapts physiologically, it engineers conditions, builds microclimates, shapes landscapes. As brain size continues to increase, social networks also grow in complexity. Cooperative alliances extend beyond immediate kin, exchange becomes an important social mechanism. Objects, useful stones, pigments, beads long before us, move between groups, carrying with them information. The earliest evidence for symbolic behavior remains debated, but the capacity for shared signs is plausible in a social ecology where teaching, ritual, and coordinated action confer reproductive advantages. caring for the injured, provisioning the old or infirm, and investing in offspring's survival become visible markers of a more elaborate social ethic, functional compassion shaped by selection, but experienced in the present as loyalty, grief, and social obligation. Migration, technology, and sociality intersect in the geographical sweep of Homo. Bands that left Africa occupied varied climates, temperate woodlands, arid steppes, montane margins. Each migration requires adjustment, different tool recipes, dietary breadth, shelter design. Local innovations accumulate and sometimes spread so that technology becomes a map of both geography and cultural learning. The bifacial hand axe that appears on one shelf can be found across continents centuries later, a testament to shared templates and traveling minds. The story of Homo is also a story of cognitive and cultural feedback loops. Tools change diets. Diets alter developmental energies. Developmental shifts lengthen learning windows. Longer learning windows enable more sophisticated tool instruction. Instruction fosters cumulative culture. Culture improves survival in new environments. What begins as occasional opportunism gradually formalizes into a pattern. Small behavioral investments compound into larger biological and social consequences. Yet the ascent of Homo is not inevitable teleology. It is marked by branching experiments. Multiple Homo species coexist at times. H. habilis, H. erectus, H. heidelbergensis, Neanderthals in Eurasia, Denisovans in Asia, each adapted in different ways to local ecologies. Some lineages persist, others disappear. Extinction prunes the tree as surely as selection shapes it. The record of Homo is noisy, intermittent, and richly contingent. There is also a speculative edge that the deep documentary voice cannot ignore. The long stretches of habitation, the ritual use of objects, the patterned disposal of bones, and the repeated repair and refinement of tools open the possibility, in imagination, of cumulative cultural architectures that might one day, given vastly more time, turn into places and monuments whose traces survive poorly in deep time. The planet's capacity to erase is vast. Erosion and tectonics eat away at human-scale constructions. The archaeological record is therefore a slender window on the deep past, biased toward durable stone and bone. Recognizing that bias keeps speculation modest, Homo's inventions were transformative in their era, but ephemeral in geological measure. Between roughly 2 million and a few 100,000 years ago, Homo reshaped the human niche. Hands refined into precise implements, fire became a social center. Migration carried minds into new climates. Cooperative labor redistributed risk. Learning scaffolds expanded into cultural inheritance. Emotions, attachment, curiosity, fear, delight in shared success were not absent but were reorganized by these technologies and social patterns. The cumulative force of these changes set a trajectory that, in later epochs, would produce forms of symbolism, art, and ultimately the reflective questions that now read back across time. But those later accomplishments are the subject of subsequent chapters. For now, the central lesson is clear. Homo's ascent was neither inevitable nor instantaneous. It was a patient accumulation of small cognitive, anatomical, and social innovations, all woven into a material culture that made the world more malleable to its makers. In the quiet tens of thousands of stone flakes and in the warming light of the first controlled fires, a lineage learned to act upon its environment in ways that would echo through the rest of the planet's story. What does it mean for a species to reach for fire and, in doing so, to reforge its relationship with time? That single image, a hand holding a spark, a night made habitable by a controlled glow, frames the long, slow pivot in which early Homo became something other than a clever ape, a maker of durable habit, a transmitter of accumulated know-how, and ultimately the architect of every later human city and temple. Between roughly 2 million and 300,000 years ago, a series of practical revolutions unfolded. Tools acquired grammar, embers became hearths, feet learned to cross continents, and voices began to bind shared worlds. These were not sudden miracles, but patient accumulations, inventions iterated again and again until the behavior itself was written into bodies and social practice. The archaeology of this era reads as a manual for growing intelligence. Stone, chosen and struck, carries an index of thought. The Olddown flake, a sharp shard struck from a core, is not merely a useful edge. It is a cognitive shortcut, the recognition that a force applied at one point can create a predictable outcome elsewhere. It taught hands the rules of percussion and the eye to see potential in raw rock, where to hold, where to strike, how much force to apply. That sensory apprenticeship mattered. The apprentice learns weight, angle, sound. The sound of flint snapping under a hammerstone became a reliable meter for success. Repetition makes pattern. Pattern makes expectation. Expectation opens the door to planning. From these early experiments emerged more formal templates. The Acheulean hand axe is a good example of a technology that implies foresight. To make one requires a mental image of a finished object, the capacity to hold that image while applying dozens of sequential blows, and the ability to teach the pattern to others. The hand axe's symmetry is not merely aesthetic, it is the trace of planning distributed through time and across minds. The maker held, in effect, a small blueprint in the head and executed it by hand. That act radically amplified what a single individual could retain. Techniques could be externalized in objects, preserved at a site, and inspected later. Tools became a kind of durable memory. This embodied cognition, the thinking that lives in hands and rhythm, carried an emotional signature. The making of good tools rewarded attention with utility. A sharper flake cut meat with less effort. A heavier hammerstone cracked a marrow-rich femur. A well-shaped hand axe was calm in the hand and reliable under stress. Those rewards fed social dynamics. Napping was an acted lesson. The novice watched, imitated, and gradually internalized the sequence. Fidelity of transmission mattered. Small variations that increased efficiency were retained. Over generations, tiny improvements compounded into qualitatively new capacities. The social environment functioned like an editing room for innovations, discarding what failed and conserving what made life easier. Fire is the other axis of transformation in this epoch. The control of fire is not simply the harnessing of heat, it is the invention of a temporal extension of day. With deliberate embers, hominins could push back the night, warm infants, harden tools through heat treatment, and cook food that previously taxed digestive systems. Cooking, once established, changes energetics, cooked starches and proteins yield calories more readily, freeing metabolic budget for brain growth and for prolonged juvenile periods necessary for learning complex behaviors. Hearths became social foci, points where light gathered bodies and attention, where hands could work at night, where stories could be enacted in gestures and song without the immediate pressure of daytime survival. The glow of the hearth extended the time available for teaching and rehearsal, deepening cultural transmission. There is evidence in burnt sediments and charred bone suggestive of controlled fire use stretching back well into this time frame. The practice was not uniform or universal. Embers had to be tended, and control across landscapes required knowledge of fuels, of how smoke behaves in wind, of how coals survive through nights and seasons. Mastery of fire was both technical and social. assigning responsibility for hearth maintenance, deciding when to move camp, how to shelter from smoke. The emotional climate around a hearth is also significant. Fire creates a sense of safety and a punctuated privacy against nocturnal predators. It convenes people into a shared social space where alliances are forged and reputations accrue. It is a technology of intimacy as much as of survival. Mobility intensified under this new tandem of tools and fire. Homo erectus and related hominins moved beyond Africa in unprecedented waves. Leaving familiar ecologies, they entered landscapes of cold seasons and unfamiliar predators. Technology, properly understood, made such journeys plausible. Portable toolkits, controlled fire, an ability to plan routes and remember resource patches. Migratory movements were not aimless dispersals, but repeated experiments in range extension. Test crossings of river valleys, seasonal forays into highlands, return migrations when conditions demanded. Each movement required new learning, knowledge of local stone sources, of seasonal plant cycles, of animal behaviors, and thus the capacity to transmit such information across bands was essential. Memory was externalized not only in tools but in shared practices. Pathways, quarrying spots, and hearth locations became cultural landmarks. Psychologically, migration produced a peculiar mix of exhilaration and anxiety. The novelty of an open plain or an unfamiliar forest stimulated exploration and opportunism, but the absence of known refuges and the presence of new predators created stresses that punished error. Social cohesion mattered more in the unfamiliar. Groups that cooperated in hunting, in childcare, in resource sharing had better odds. The evolutionary weight of cooperation rose. In this stage, social networks expanded from small family units into larger, interconnected bands, where information and innovations could be exchanged across distances. Those networks functioned as engines of cultural accumulation. A new technique learned in one valley could spread, with modification, across continents. Within these expanding social webs, a proto-language likely took shape. Language, properly defined, is a system that maps sounds and gestures to shared meanings. The earliest communicative systems were probably modest, coordinated gestures, alarm calls, imitative vocalizations, anchored to immediate contexts. Yet the social demands of coordinated hunts, the teaching of napping sequences, and the need to remember and transmit geographic information selected for greater communicative resolution. The hearth's long nights provided the necessary scaffold to experiment with symbolic vocalizations, ritualized calls, sequences of sounds to indicate location or action, and the beginnings of shared reference. Over tens of thousands of years, these communicative habits would complexify, more precise naming, more elaborate sequences to instruct a child in napping or to coordinate a group during a hunt, and perhaps the first conventions for representing non-immediate objects. That rock over the ridge, or the place where water pools in dry season. Primitive language is not a sudden spark, but a slow accretion of capacity and practice. It reorganizes social life. With shared reference, groups can plan farther ahead, coordinate complex multi-step activities, and hold in memory events not currently present. Memory and planning together shift selective environments toward longer juvenile dependency, greater teaching, and the cultural storage of knowledge. Emotion again becomes central. Gossip, reputation, shame, and pride become possible because language allows for the distribution of information beyond direct observation. Social bonds are reinforced through narratives, histories of successful hunts, lists of seasonal foraging techniques, perhaps even songs that encode place. Signs of symbolic behavior, deliberate pigment use, personal ornaments, the careful placement of objects appear later and in a patchy way, but their possibility is rooted in these earlier communicative expansions. Even the simplest mark on a rock signals an investment, a deliberate alteration of landscape to carry meaning across time. Such acts presage future rituals, burials, and the symbolic scaffolding of community identity. Importantly, these developments were uneven across space and time. Multiple hominin lineages coexisted and experimented with overlapping toolkits and behaviors. Some groups remained largely within Africa, refining local traditions. Others moved into temperate Eurasia and adapted to cold seasons, wearing animal skins and building more durable shelters. Climatic shifts, glacial pulses and interglacials imposed new regimes of selection that favored behavioral flexibility. Those groups that could alter diet, develop storage strategies, and coordinate across extended social networks had comparative advantages. The narrative is not one of linear progress toward an inevitable modern mind, but of repeated contingencies resolved through cultural innovation. The emotional tenor of this long epoch is subtle and powerful. There is courage in crossing a river into unknown woodlands, grief in the loss of kin to a predator, the comfort of a shared hearth, the quiet satisfaction of a child learning to strike a flake, and the abiding anxiety that comes with living where weather and large animals can be merciless. These feelings are not decorative, they are selection pressures made psychological. Those groups that cultivated trust and empathy could coordinate labor, share food in lean times, and transmit complex skills across generations. Altruism and reciprocity were behavioral strategies with evolutionary payoffs. They structured daily life as surely as tool shapes did. By 300,000 years ago, the biological and cultural lineages that would lead to anatomically modern Homo sapiens had crystallized key features. Brain size and reorganization supported more extensive social cognition. Hand morphology allowed ever finer manipulation. Vocal tract changes made a broader range of sounds possible, and the cultural repertoire had grown broad enough to permit durable traditions. Campsites became more elaborate, hearths arranged with care, accumulations of flaked stone demonstrating regional styles, and perhaps the first rudimentary forms of long-term place attachment. The seeds of village life were not yet planted, but the habits that would make villages plausible. Long childhoods, shared child rearing, accumulation of durable tools, and settled camps in resource-rich microzones were in place. The dawn of civilization is not a single moment at which cities and scripts appear. It is a long prehistory in which the preconditions for symbolic communities, the capacity to project plans into the future, to codify practices, to transmit knowledge across generations, and to create shared meanings, were assembled. These are cultural technologies as much as physical ones: fire, flint, the hearth, the template of a hand axe, the patterned syllable, the practice of teaching a child to strike a stone so it will yield a predictable edge. Each is a modest instrument with outsized consequences when aggregated. There is humility in this account. The record is fragmentary. Erosion, burial, and tectonic upheaval erase most of what these peoples made. Stone is durable, flesh, wood, hide, and speech vanish. What survives is an outline, a faint chorus of impressions: burned earth, flaked stones arranged in a scatter, a line of hearths, traces of long occupation. From such slender threads the deep story must be woven. Yet the outline suffices to show how small acts, a knack for percussion, a decision to tend coals through rainy nights, a shared vocal sign for river, aggregate into a cultural weight capable of altering evolutionary trajectories. In the end, the scene closes with a simple, abiding image: A band gathered around a flickering hearth at dusk, hands busy with tools, voices trading short, patterned calls, a child watching and learning. The ember's glow draws faces into relief. It collects attention and memory. In the deep quiet between the heartbeats of geological epochs, such gatherings repeat. They are the patient work of a species learning to externalize knowledge, to carry memory beyond an individual life, and to move together across a planet. From those embodied practices, civilization, in its many later guises, would eventually be possible. The miracle, if it can be called that, is not a single invented thing, but the slow accumulation of small disciplines: craft, control of fire, migration, and the beginnings of talk. Together they open a new kind of history, a human history written not in stone. Alone, but in the distributed minds and shared practices that first learned to keep a light through the night.